They ran them off while they do all this stuff. Pies of seeds and something else.
And it's just like
Just fascinating to see. I wish I would have.
All right, we can go ahead and get started. My name is Brady Holst. I'm the chairman of the production committee at the Illinois Soybean Association, and the production committee is in charge of outreach, research, trialing networks in the state of Illinois, and then bringing together public and private entities to help with that. And through the outreach, one of the things we do is events like today, like the Better Beans events. If you like this one, unfortunately it's the last one, but there is another event that is our biggest event, is the Soybean Summit, and that is on the 1st in Champaign. So if you want to go to that or haven't registered, you can go to our website. And we're going to have a lot more about what the production and agronomy team is doing at the Soybean Association a little bit later. But first, we're going to have a word from the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, which is the sponsor of today's event.
All right. Thank you. Yes, so my name is Brogan Shantz. I'm here today on behalf of the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. We are a subsidiary of the Iowa Soybean Association. So much like how the Illinois soy is structured, at the end of the day, I answer to an elected board of farmers. So Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, what we do is we work with Scope 3 in settings, and we are able to quantify the carbon that is sequestered by producers who are introducing practice changes such as cover crops, no-till, reduced tillage operations, really any combination of those. We are then able to generate payments to the producers based on the amount of carbon, and that payment is provided by our partners that we work with. Big key partners in the state of Illinois are Pepsi, Ingredion, Cargill. All of these corporations have made their own sustainability commitments, and they have determined that the state of Illinois is within their scope of production. So any producer in the state of Illinois making these practice changes that is generating carbon sequestration, they are willing to pay for that. A couple key characteristics or highlights of the program is we in 2023, we averaged $33 an acre in payments to producers. We only work in one-year contracts at a time. Those, we do provide payment estimates to producers prior to committing to anything, so you will actually know, what you are expected to be paid. We offer those payments in 2 installments every year. There's no acre max or minimum for enrollment, and then we've got field program reps such as myself positioned across the state of Illinois who are ready and willing to help you get enrolled. So if you have any other questions or want more information, we do have some information on the back table there, or you can come jump me at any time today, and I'll be glad to talk with you. So thank you.
Thanks, Brogan. Good
Good morning, everyone. I want to say hello again and thank you on behalf of the ISA Agronomy team for being here this morning. Luckily, we had some good road conditions, although the fog was a little iffy, but luckily no ice this morning, and so it's good to see you all in person and kicking off our last Better Beans, so we're happy to be here. My name is Abigail Peterson. I'm the Director of Agronomy at ISA. Some of my team is here today, so if you see anyone in these t-shirts, please come up to us, say hi, ask us what we do at ISA. If you're a farmer in this room, you are our bosses, so tell us what you want to complain about and what you got problems with, and we'll do our best. But that's what we're here to do, is hear what you would like to learn and what you're needing in the field, and for us to provide that for you. So as part of production, we are one of the 3 pillars at ISA. So wondering where your checkoff goes, it's pretty important that you should know what your checkoff does. And so there is departments of government relations and market development. And it's been pretty cool this month. We've had teams of farmers already go to Asia, go to DC, and talk on behalf of what they're seeing in their fields as farmers and their needs are, whether that be with a legislator, whether that be with the EPA, or whether that be with market and trade development over in Asia, and talking about soybean quality and why sourcing Illinois beans are the best. And so it's pretty exciting to know what your checkoff does and how it advocates for you as farmers, how farmers can get involved with our checkoff. One thing that we highly encourage you and really value are the surveys that were passed out, and also there's QR codes for you to fill out our production concerns survey. So that's everything you can mention to us from what you're seeing in the fields as far as disease concerns, pest concerns, but any concerns that you're needing and wanting more research, wanting U of I extension, wanting community college input, wanting any of the resources across the state to pull together to get information. We want to hear your concerns, as well as you'll notice our speakers today, we partner as well as with the other states across the board in the U.S. We don't have all the answers on the agronomy team, but we know where to find them. And so it's very important for us to know that if you have concerns and it's not in the state for that answer, we'll go find it for you. So we're really excited for the speakers today to talk on their expertise. In the back of the room, there are some free handouts, those little handy field guidebooks that are always fun to lose in the truck. I think we have the most updated versions of those, so please take some along with you. There are some opportunities to take hold of. There's free SCN testing going on that you can submit. Not only is that a great way to know SCN counts in your own field, but also a great way for us to survey the state as well as far as county-wide numbers and getting that back to the right people to start to know where numbers fall currently. We also have an on-farm trialing network. So part of the production team at ISA, our strategic goal is to provide regional information that is practically adapted to your fields, bringing research to you. And one thing that we really need is more on-farm research in Illinois. And so that's partnering with you as farmers, with Extension, with the researchers in the state to bring value of that research to your fields. If you're seeing research being conducted that doesn't apply to you, that's a problem. And so from the surveys, also a way to get involved is on-farm research. And so there is a way to sign up if you're interested in future research ideas on your own farm, or the collaborations that we're forming at ISA for us to bridge information with you and expand the expertise and knowledge that Illinois can provide the whole state with better information from the field. If you're wondering what your FY24 research projects are this year, there is a research guidebook in the back that shows every single research project that is bucketed within our team that is for specific agronomy research. There's a lot more projects beyond this. Like Brady mentioned, we do a lot with outreach and other partnerships, but these are just the main research projects we have going on. So I encourage you to pick one of these up in the back, because what's really important is if you check out our Soy Advisor, you can follow these researchers along in the field. So one thing for me is at the end of the year, reading pages and pages of protocols and graphs and summaries doesn't always translate to me at the end of the year. I like to see it more visually. I like to see things a little bit more digestible, and that's what we're doing at Soy Advisor. So there's videos out in the field where the researchers talking about the protocols that they're conducting and why those analysis and summaries and what they get as results, what that matters on your fields and the farmer, and what you can take away as either a success or something that we learned from that study and that you can actually use on your operation. And so a lot going on there with research and what we're doing with the on-farm trialing, what we're doing with partners. Like I said, we work with Extension, the community colleges around the state, students. You'll hear more from Stephanie Porter on our summit coming up, which is a huge event. But beyond that, we'll also have a lot of summer field days. So this year we'll be across the state throughout July, and we're in the planning process now, so already planning for all the way into August, September, across the state in those fields, bringing the researchers out to you, which is really fun and really what we like to do. We don't like to be in the office all the time. So we hope to see you at our summer field events. Keep up with the research that's going on. Please bring questions, feedback all throughout the season and the growing season, and keep up what we're doing because we're really excited to be here and to have a great growing season with you this year. So I'm going to now pass it off to our outreach agronomist, Stephanie Porter, to start the day off.
Well, good morning. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I guess I'm short. Before I introduce Meaghan here, I want to give you some housekeeping tips. So again, my name is Stephanie Porter, and I'm the outreach agronomist as well as a certified crop advisor. So speaking of CCAs, if you need to get CEU units, we have where you can scan or write your name down over by Connie, back where you checked in at registration. Connie's in the back there. So if you need that, currently, Miss Kelsey Litchfield is, she's live on YouTube. So tell all your friends, first of all, and welcome to everybody that's live on YouTube. Kelsey will be getting you information if you need to know about how to get your CEUs online. So she'll be taking care of that. Next up, we are going to have a total of 3 presentations today, as well as a coffee break at 10:15. We will also have lunch, so please, I hope you didn't get too full, but we also have lunch available at the end of this event. And again, Abigail already mentioned this, but if you have any needs, any questions, any concerns, just come find somebody with the rooted shirt on or a ISA staff member. So our first presenter this morning is Meaghan Anderson. Meaghan is a field agronomist in Central Iowa and an extension field specialist at Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, where educational programming is available for farmers, agribusiness, pesticide applicators, certified crop advisors, as well as other individuals interested in crop production. Her areas of expertise include weed management, weed biology, cover crops, corn, and soybean management, as well as integrated pest management. So let's welcome Meaghan.
Thank you. Okay, let's grab this. Morning, everybody. Morning. Oh, good. Okay, we're gonna have some hopefully conversation today, so don't fall asleep on me. My name's Meaghan Anderson, and I've been asked to present a little bit about winning against weeds. And I think that's an important topic. How was weed management in this area last year? So-so? I see a lot of like, it was okay. All right, what's your biggest weed problem? Water hemp? How many say water hemp's your biggest problem? Oh, good, because that's what I'm going to talk about. That was perfect. It's like I planned it. So just a little bit about myself, because I assume most of you don't know who I am. My name's Meaghan Anderson, and I am an extension field agronomist in Central Iowa. I used to be in Eastern Iowa over in this 8 area, and then I moved to Central Iowa because it got me closer to my family farm. And I worked in Illinois for ever so brief a time for Monsanto when I was in school. And so I always thought that where I lived in Iowa was very flat until I went and started working in like Farmer City, Mahomet, and Champaign, Illinois. And then I learned that that was actually what flat looked like, and it was not where I lived. But I'm an Iowa State grad, and Central Iowa got me closer to my family farm. And so I'm very vested in this weed management thing because it's a big problem for us. And so today, I would like to talk a little bit about the fact that water hemp is developing herbicide resistance faster than we are developing herbicides. That's a big problem for management because we rely so heavily on those herbicides. We need to tailor herbicide programs better to manage our weeds, specifically water hemp for most of us, right? And for some people in individual fields, it may be a different species. And we could talk a little bit about that, right? But maybe in one field you have Pennsylvania smartweed, or in some other field there's ivy leaf morning glory or velvet leaf or something showing up, right? That we need to focus a little bit better on managing that species. But overall, most of us are trying to just simply do a better job of managing water hemp. So let's talk about that. And then finally, this is like the striped elephant in the back of every room every time I have this discussion, right? Is that we are not going to be very successful at managing water hemp unless we include other tactics aside from herbicides. And it's something that nobody wants to talk about, and we don't want to face the fact that it's coming, but it's like a freight train coming toward us right now. And so we have to talk about it, right? The farmers that are able to better adopt some of these non-chemical tactics are going to be successful in the end, right? The rest of us are going to be drowning in water hemp seed. So let's talk about herbicide resistance. Right, so I don't live or work in Illinois, but you are winners, congratulations, that there are 7 herbicide groups that water hemp is known to be resistant to, and all 7 of those have been found in Illinois water hemp populations. And so that could mean one thing, which is that you have far worse water hemp issues and herbicide resistance issues than everybody else. But I suspect probably what it actually means is that you have really good weed scientists that are doing a better job of monitoring populations than we are in Iowa or in Minnesota or Indiana or wherever else. So you're the winner, but you're not alone. So Iowa does some herbicide resistance work as well. And so this was some work, just a quick little summary here, right, of some work that was done in both 2013 and 2019. 2013 is in red, 2019 is in yellow. And so this was originally done by Mike Owen and then followed up by a grad student in 2019, where basically they selected random GPS points across the state of Iowa, determined which ones were in soybean fields, drove to those soybean fields ahead of harvest, and if there was water hemp above the canopy, they collected the water hemp seed, right? And then they processed the water hemp seed and observed the resistances in those populations. And so not only did we have resistance to 5 different herbicide groups in Iowa, so they studied groups 2, 5, 9, 14, and 27. Right, so that's like our ALS inhibitors, the pursuit type products. It's atrazine, it's glyphosate. They used lactofen or Cobra as their group 14 product, and then maybe mesotrione as the group 27. And so what we've seen over time is this original, we have multiple resistance. This is to the 1x rate, right? So you can see we had some populations of about 100 populations were only resistant to one of those 5 herbicide groups in 2013. A lot of them were resistant to 3 herbicide groups. And when you used a 4x rate of the herbicide, right, we were able to see that we got a little bit better control with some of those herbicides. But the problem is that our population is advancing very quickly. And so just 6 years later, that yellow bar represents how much of the same fields, right, going back to those same populations, are now resistant to multiple herbicide groups. So basically every population they studied was resistant to more than one herbicide. So water hemp is smart, right? We're not going to get rid of these herbicide resistances in these populations. They're just building up over time. And so now it's not 2-way resistant, now maybe it's 4-way resistant 6 years later. And that didn't take very long. And we didn't get any new herbicides in that time frame. And so something that they didn't do in this study is they didn't research resistance to glufosinate or the growth regulators. And so we know that Illinois has had growth regulator resistance, and glufosinate is one that has yet to be discovered in a water hemp population in this area. And so Iowa State took all those random populations as well as a number of farmer-submitted populations where they suspected they had some resistance, and they just tested them against a 1x rate of glufosinate, 2,4-D, and dicamba. What do you think they found? This is where you talk. It's very helpful. You think they killed them all? No, not even close, unfortunately. Right, and so we can't say that these populations are necessarily resistant, but what we can say is that we definitely have reduced susceptibility to 2,4-D, dicamba, and glufosinate in these populations that they looked at, right? So we had basically, I think, 17% survival of the plants that were treated with 2,4-D. There was about 5% survival from dicamba and 4% survival from Liberty, or glufosinate. And so that was kind of our first sign that this is obviously a problem, right? We know that this is happening. We get phone calls from farmers where those plants are not dying in the field to that 1x rate of the herbicide, and it's always like, well, could it be resistant, or could it be the weather conditions that we applied it in, or the carrier volume that you used, or the rate that you chose, whatever it may be, right? It's always very difficult to understand that, but this is kind of a more scientific way to really look at these populations. And then that led up perfectly to the fact that Bayer actually came to us this last summer in early September, and they told us that they had 2 populations in Iowa, and they refer to them as likely herbicide resistant, but I think given the fact that they had 2 years to study them, right, 2021 and 2022 is when these 2 populations were identified, I'm going to call them that they're basically resistant, right? If they came out with a press release about it, basically, and came to us, right? We don't think dicamba is going to kill those populations, and we know that those already exist elsewhere, right? It would be so silly to think that well, they only found 2. There's no more, right? We're doing okay. And so let's talk about water hemp management, because the herbicide options that we are going to have in the future are few and far between. All right, we're just checking them off the list. And this isn't a new thing that these herbicide resistances are occurring, right? So Iowa State monitored 2013 and 2019 populations, but we know that the growth regulators were already failing long before that. And we know that now we have group 15 resistance building in populations, and Liberty resistance, glufosinate resistance, was already discovered in a Palmer amaranth population in Arkansas in 2019 as well. What the heck are we going to do? Grow corn? Walk fields, I like that. That's good. I hope you're building a labor force of children somewhere. I only have 2 kids. They're not going to be very helpful, I don't think. Not working on that very hard. Yeah, so there's a difference in where we're sitting now and a difference in where we're going to look in the future, right? Has anybody seen a field that looks like this? Absolutely, right? Has anybody seen fields that look like this? So what do you think weed management is going to look like in a decade in those 2 fields? How do you think they'll look in 10 years? I would almost be willing to bet that this field, right, that nice clean field, is still going to be clean. Because I imagine that the farmer farming in that field has prioritized weed management for a long time. I suspect that they have a very low seed input every year, and they have a much smaller seed bank of water hemp seed than this field over here, right? It's very difficult to dig yourself out of this kind of hole when we have weed management that's that bad. But it's not impossible. But it starts like today to fix that, right? We can't wait and sit on our hands and say, oh, you know, we'll deal with it next year. And that, unfortunately, is a lot of what I have been seeing in Iowa is that, Marty, no offense, but everybody's willing to spend 25 bucks an acre, 30 bucks an acre on a fungicide But at that beginning of the season, when we're looking at those herbicide programs, they're like, oh, but how do we make it cost less? Like, just $5 less an acre would be great. Anybody get that sentiment out there? Right? Yeah, I get it too. And so it's not all about cost, right? It's about managing that program better. But the end goal for all of us needs to be this, right? Preventing weed seed from entering the seed bank is how we prevent new weeds. So how do we keep the seed from going back into the soil? And so there's a few pinch points in our system, in our production system, right? Those weeds all have to germinate and come out of the ground, right? Okay, well, maybe we can control them before they come out of the ground, right? In that germination process. They all have to produce seed, all these annual weeds. How do we keep them from producing seed? That seed has to drop from those plants. Can we keep the seed from dropping from the plants back into the soil so that we prevent this? And that is in a cornfield, and believe me, I've seen a lot worse weed control in corn in the last 2 to 3 years. And I'm getting nods, so that means you probably have as well. And you know what that means when we go back to soybean the next year? That means it's harder to kill the weeds in soybean. So Bob Hartzler did this really nice summary of this work from Wisconsin, and I'm going to talk about it because I think it's one of the best summaries of chemical weed control for water hemp that I've ever seen. 5 years of chemical weed control in water hemp and kind of what they learned. This is a great summary available on the Wisconsin Weeds. It's wiskweeds.info website. Rodrigo Worley did this. Yeah, Rodrigo is excellent. And so I just want to show you these to start with. So this is kind of grouped by the primary active ingredient in the mixture. So we've got metribuzin. These two have sulfentrazone. Right, sulfentrazone, that's those authority products that we're all pretty familiar with. And then these two have pyroxasulfone, which are the Zidua. And so the red graph is research work plots, the weed control in those plots when they use metribuzin, or sulfentrazone, or pyroxasulfone by themselves. And then the yellow is where they used premixes containing those products. And so like the metribuzin premix was Boundary, where it's metribuzin and dual. The sulfentrazone premix was Authority MTZ, which is sulfentrazone and metribuzin. And then the Zidua Pro is the premix for the pyroxasulfone, with pyroxasulfone Sharpen and Pursuit. Which, are you gonna pick the red or the yellow? Which looks better? How many say red? Okay, good. Anybody say yellow? You like the yellow control? No, the red control, the red graph was better in every scenario looking at these active ingredients. Why? Anybody have thoughts?
Higher concentration of the active ingredient.
Higher concentration of the active ingredient. I have a ringer up in the front, of course, knows everything, right? Rate selection, generally speaking, right? Product is super important, but it's one thing to pick a really good product. It's another thing to make sure that that product is going to effectively manage your target weed. And so, for example, I'm going to look at this Spartan, which is the sulfentrazone, because that's a product that I have a ton of farmers that use. So they compared, in these research plots, lots of research plots, 8 ounces of Spartan, or sulfentrazone, and they compared it to Authority MTZ, or we're comparing it to their plots that had Authority MTZ. And you could see here, those Authority MTZ plots had 4 to 5.8 ounces of Spartan versus 8 ounces. Right? In some cases, it had half of the rate that they had in those other plots. Do you think that's going to affect its ability to control water hemp? So what's the advantage of, oh wait, we'll hold off on that part. Okay, so the pre-rate is really important for pre-weed control. It's also important when you go back and you look at how well those plots performed after a post-application. So this graph is a little confusing, so I'm going to explain it right. So if you had excellent or greater than 90% control of water hemp with your pre, and you came back and you sprayed a post, this is the percent control you had 2 weeks after the post, right? So excellent weed control in the pre, or water hemp control in the pre, you had, you know, maybe 95, 96% control of the water hemp after your post. If you had poor, bad control with the pre, less than 60% control, 2 weeks after the post, that post only got you up to maybe 78, 79% control. Why'd that happen? Those posts, they're so good at cleaning things up. I just want them all to emerge and then I'll just kill them all. We used to do that with glyphosate, right? Yeah. Oh, it was so satisfying to take down those really big plants. We're not there anymore. Our herbicides don't work that well, right? We use more contact products, Liberty especially, right? 2,4-D and dicamba. I can maybe take down a 6-inch weed, right? I'll maybe get marginal on the label, but I'm not taking down a 12, 18-inch weed with that. We're just not there anymore. And so the best control we're going to get is if we can keep things from emerging so you have far fewer plants there when you spray your post. And that's a really hard thing to get used to, right? Like pulling a sprayer into a field where you really can't see much for weeds in it and spraying the few plants that are out there is tough to do. It's very hard to do. But that's where we need to be because we need to prevent these things from producing seed. And so one of the ways, right, I think we're all pretty good about choosing the proper product, right, or choosing active ingredients, herbicides that are effective against water hemp. We've got that down pat. But I still think there's some work that we can do on rates to make these products more effective. Does anybody think about the herbicide rate real specifically when you're choosing your herbicides? A little bit? Okay, so I want to just show some examples. These are corn examples because I remember I said that management in corn makes a big difference for soybean. So this is Resicor. Does anybody use Resicor? We got a few people. 2.75 quarts. That was my full rate on the label for the soil type that I was looking at, right? Like I kind of pick a medium soil type, 1.5 to 3% organic matter. So usually on the high end of that, 2.5 to 3. Anybody familiar enough with your rate? Are you at 2.75 quarts with your Resicor? No? Shaking their head no. So remember, this is the full rate of the premix, and in many cases we're not going out even with the full rate of the premix. And so in that full rate of the premix, to control water hemp, you're getting almost 2 pounds of acetochlor, or harness, and you're getting 0.2 of a pound of mesotrione or callisto. And how do I know what that rate means, that almost 2 pounds of acetochlor? Well, I go and I compare it to, well, if I applied harness by itself, how much acetochlor could I get in a full rate of harness? Still with me? Right, so I go look at a full rate of harness, and for the same soil type as the full rate of Resicor, and I could apply 2.41 pounds. So I'm getting, you know, almost half a pound more acetochlor in the full rate. Right, I mean, the Resicor really has a pretty good rate of acetochlor as far as premixes go, but there's a little bit of room to work with, right? We're leaving maybe a half pound of acetochlor on the table somewhere that we could be using to control our water hemp better. And then 0.2 of a pound AI of the mesotrione, that's pretty close to the pre-full rate of the callisto. Pretty good, right? That's a not bad, right? We got 2 herbicide active ingredients that are gonna work against water hemp, or we hope will work against water hemp. We expect they will. Let's look at a couple other ones. So Harness Extra is another one. We're focusing in on acetochlor. 3 quarts of Harness Extra is going to get us 2.3 pounds of acetochlor versus the 2.41 pounds. That's pretty good, right? Just 1/10 of a pound left on the table. But what about Sure Start? Is anybody here using Sure Start? No. Did anybody use it in the last 5 years, right? Resicor is, of course, like the new Sure Start. And a lot of my farmers have moved on to that too, but I still hear about people using it. And so 3 pints is the full rate of Sure Start. We've got 1.4 pounds of acetochlor in that. Ouch. 60% of the full rate versus the 2.4 pounds. And the other 2 active ingredients in the Sure Start are not effective against water hemp, right? So you go out with Sure Start, you gotta realize that even if you're at the full rate, you're getting 60% of a full rate of acetochlor, and that is the only thing in that premix that's doing any good against water hemp. So we gotta analyze our herbicide programs a little bit. And this math thing, has anybody done this? Anybody doing this when you're planning programs? Maybe a little bit. Oh, there's somebody in the back who is. Thank you. Okay, so how do we do this? First of all, I have a resource for everyone up here that goes through examples of, you know, if it's a dry product that's measured in ounces, if it's a liquid product in fluid ounces, or if it's a liquid product in pints or quarts or whatever. And so you are welcome to take those. They're very, very helpful. I made up an Excel document so I can do it fast, because I now get asked so often from farmers that I work with about this that I have to just be able to pull the Excel document up and say, okay, it's measured in pints, right? Here's how I do this. But there's 2 things on the label that you need to know. One of which is you need this early part of the label where right down here it says it contains 3.75 pounds of acetochlor, 0.38 pounds of clopyrrolid, and 0.12 pounds of flumetzylam active ingredient per gallon. So you need that information. And then you need the rate that you intend to use, right? And so for a product like Sure Start, maybe that's going to be the full rate. Maybe it's going to be something else. But when you compare it to the active ingredient by itself, right? So if I'm going to compare Sure Start to Harness, then you need to be looking at what the full rate is that you can apply for your soil types. And so then you just do a little bit of math. I know it's terrible. 3 pints per 1 acre times 128 fluid ounces has 8 pints in it, right? That's 48 fluid ounces per acre. And I cross the pints off to get fluid ounces per acre. And then the next one, I've got 48 fluid ounces per 1 acre now. And I'm going to multiply it by that concentration, which is 3.75 pounds of acetochlor per 128 fluid ounces. And that gets me to my 1.41 pounds of acetochlor per acre. Cross those off. Can everyone go home and do this now? Excellent. Let's talk a little bit more through it. So, pros and cons of premixes. Obviously, there's a reason that we use these, even if the rates are occasionally or often lower than they are in the individual AIs by themselves. So what are some pros? What are some reasons that you choose to use premixes?
Ease of life.
What?
Ease of life.
Ease of life, is that what you said? Yeah, right? Easy mixing, came in 1 jug, right? Pour it in the tank, right? Inductor cone, whatever. It's easy. What else? Is water hemp your only weed out in every field? No, right? So premixes offer some benefit in that you get a variety of herbicide products that are going to control a broader range of weed issues than a single AI will. Anything else? I think the ease is the big one, right? Like, you don't have to worry about mixing it yourself. You don't have to worry about whether these 2 products can be put together in the tank without causing some issue. You don't have to jar test, right? I don't know whether they're more cost effective, right? What?
I think price would be a big one. I think if
Okay.
I put programs together and I'm making my own premixes, a lot of times it's more expensive.
Okay, making the own premixes a lot of times more expensive. So let's talk about that, and I'm going to go through one example. I'm glad you brought that up. What are some cons of premixes? Any?
Lower rates, we just talked.
Yep, lower rates. Another one I would say is that sometimes you get products that you don't need, right? Like if you don't have a really broad spectrum of weed issues, large seeded broadleaves all the way to very small seeded broadleaves, right? Big seeded grasses like woolly cupgrass or something. Sometimes it does have products you don't need, right? That you're paying for that you don't necessarily need out there. And then the other thing that I would say is that I think to an extent, not always, but sometimes you pay for convenience. Right, so sometimes the cost of those could be more expensive than if you tried to put things together yourself. And so I think of this like I can go and I can buy Chex Mix mixed together, right? It's cheap food, right? I go to the gas station, buy a bag of Chex Mix, or I can make it myself. And I think there are some pros to making it myself, because I like garlic and I like butter. And these things, they just never have enough seasoning for me. I don't know about you. They don't have enough seasoning for me. And then I love these little, the rye chip things. Those are real good. And there's like 10 of them in the whole bag. Every time I buy it, right? I buy it because I love it, and then I regret it because it doesn't have what I want. And so I'm going to go through a little scenario. And this is one that I did just a few weeks ago with a farmer. And so I'm calling him Farmer A. His actual name is Keaton. I really hope he isn't watching this online. And he felt disappointing weed control in 2023. And so we went out, we looked at some of his fields, and this is like by far the worst spot. His weed control really was not that terrible, but he did have some areas in fields and just a few spots where the water hemp was a little bit out of control, and he had a little bit of velvet leaf in some of the fields, but not all of them. And so we talked about it. We went through what he did. He had a 3-way premix. It was a group 5, 14, 15. It was like the Cadillac of premixes, right? Those 3 herbicide groups are like the 3 that I would put together if I wanted to try to kill water hemp really well and effectively. And he used Enlist, glyphosate, and I believe he had some dual 2 Magnum in his post application. And so we talked a little bit about that, and something that he thought was, well, I kind of like that premix. I like the premix approach, but can I make it better? And so this is like the idea of, you really like Chex Mix, right? It's pretty good stuff. But it doesn't have everything you want, right? Like maybe you like peanuts, or maybe you're like me and you really like those little rye chip things. So what he thought was, well, maybe I take my premix, or I take a premix, and I look at how I can make it more effective, right? I can add to it to make it better. And so these are the 3 programs that he ended up looking at. And so just so you know, oh man, that yellow, it gets kind of washed out. It looks really nice and pale on here, and it looks like Dayglow yellow on here. He last year had used 26 ounces of this product, Antares Complete. And so these are the 3 programs he's looking at this year, and these are the herbicide groups. And so one was, he said, okay, I used 26 ounces of Antares Complete last year, and that just didn't totally cut it for me. I know I'm going to have to make a change. And so what he was looking at was, okay, do I use this same herbicide program and I add this blanket 4F, which is something that he could get from his local co-op, and that was just more sulfentrazone. All right, so the product had sulfentrazone in it, it had metribuzin, and then it had metolachlor or dual. And so he said, okay, I'm just going to use that same program, but I'm going to bump up my rate. I'm going to add like 7 ounces of blanket to get me to the full rate of sulfentrazone. Because what he didn't realize was, in this 26 ounces of Antares Complete, when he did the math on that, that had about 1/4 of the full rate of sulfentrazone, right? Like we're not even at 60% like we were at the acetochlor in the Sure Start. We're at like 25%. And so he said, okay, I'm going to bulk this up. So this program this year, this example, had 4 1/3 ounces of metribuzin, a pint of metolachlor, and 12 ounces of sulfentrazone. That's what he was comfortable with based on what the rate said. He knows he's going to come back in with more dual later, so he's not real worried about the fact that that's a pretty low rated dual. And he's on high pH soils, so he wanted to keep that metribuzin rate pretty low. Because unlike in Illinois, we have all these like finicky issues in Iowa where metribuzin will burn the heck out of our soybeans in high pH soils. So he wants to keep that rate pretty low. And then he wanted to compare it, so his co-op, one of their recommended programs was 1.5 pints of Fierce MTZ. And so that had 4.5 ounces, so tiny bit more metribuzin. And then instead of having sulfentrazone, it had flumioxazin or Valor. 1.5 ounces, that's about a half rate of the Valor. And it had 1.92 ounces of pyroxasulfone. That's close to a half rate of the Zidua, the pyroxasulfone. And then he said, okay, well, what if I go with the full rate of the Antares Complete, which is going to have about half of what I need for the sulfentrazone, and then I add more blanket 4F. So then he gets 6 2/3 ounces metribuzin, 1.5 pints of metolachlor, and 12 fluid ounces of sulfentrazone because he bumped that rate up, maxed it out. And then he looked at the cost, and this is something that I don't often get to do, right? Nobody ever tells me prices for things, and we got to do kind of a cool analysis. So I'm curious, right? Look at those programs. Which one do you think was the most expensive? Can I get like a 1, 2, or 3 going across from the left? So number 1 would be this 2.5 pints of Antares, 2 would be Fierce MTZ, and then 3 would be the lower rate of Antares with more blanket. Which one do you think was the most expensive? Somebody says 2. Someone says 3. Anybody else? Nobody else wants to guess even this. 1. Oh, we got some 1s. Okay, what do you think was the cheapest one? Any thoughts? 1. All right, this is good. We've got no idea, do we? This is excellent. Okay, and I mean, honestly, I would have had no idea. And so this is just one example, right? It's not always going to be this scenario, but it's worth looking at. So his full rate of Antares with blanket 4F was $35.66 per acre. How's that compare to your pre-cost? Same? Okay. All right, 1.5 pints of Fierce MTZ, $38.40 per acre. Right? For a half rate of flumioxazin and a half rate of Zidua? Dang. Okay, now this program, the one he had last year, and some more sulfentrazone, $26.67 per acre. Now, I'm feeling pretty smart after he tells me this. That doesn't happen very often. But I was feeling pretty smart because he came to me with these 2 programs, and I said, well, why don't you just do what you did last year and add more sulfentrazone to that? Went and did the math. That looks pretty good. Right? He knows he's going to put dual in with his post anyway. So his dual, right, his dual rate's going to go up a little bit, but it's going to be the same as what he did last year. So he just saved himself basically $9 an acre by making his own mix. I don't know whether that's the case every time, right? I don't know whether this is going to be your scenario specifically, but it's something that I think is really worth looking into because I believe he's going to have far better weed control this year than he did last year, and he did it at basically a cost savings to comparing it to the premixes that he was thinking about using. And so if the cost alone isn't enough to do it, I think the control should be. And something, these are from Aaron Hager, so I'm very thankful to Aaron, your University of Illinois weed scientist, for sharing these with me, that this rate of especially the group 15 products, right, we talked about those low rates that we see in the corn products sometimes. This is so important because you are starting to see resistance. And I'm sure we're seeing it in Iowa too, but we just haven't recognized it yet because we don't have a good weed scientist out on the ground actually doing this research work. But this is harness, resistant field versus resistant population versus sensitive population, dual 2 magnum, resistant versus susceptible, outlook, resistant, susceptible, Zidua, resistant, susceptible. One of those looks a lot better than the rest, right? The harness looks pretty good compared to the rest. But all of these are starting to fail, if not completely failing. And these are at the full rates of these products. And so when you look at these individual populations, again, this is from Aaron looking at 2 resistant populations compared to 2 susceptible populations. And this is dual 2 magnum at increasing rates all the way up to basically 2.5 pints, which is essentially the full rate that you can come up with. And you can see they have plants coming up here compared with this susceptible population where it takes a much lower rate to control them. And so imagine if instead of at the full rate, you are at a 50% rate. That residual on that product is going to not last you very long at all. and we are going to be letting a lot more water hemp through. And so that looks bad with the dual, but I think with the harness, it's equally as scary, because while you can still control them at the full rate, or you get a longer period of control at the full rate, I should say, you are still losing control compared with these susceptible populations. See how many more of them are present at these low rates than in the susceptible population. And this is the reality of where we are right now, where we're getting resistance to these residual products. We are shortening the life of the residual, and it's hard to see it in the field. And we're not going to know it until it smacks us in the face. Any questions about that herbicide rate stuff?
I guess on my side, when you start throwing chemicals in together, I worry about compatibility. That's
absolutely
a major thing. So
yeah.
I think that's one thing when we talk about premixes, it just, the ease of life comes in there, but also trying to throw a bunch of, and we haven't talked to adjuvants or other things that get thrown in the tank. This is just plain Jane product, you know, so obviously it should work very well in these settings, but in reality, sometimes it doesn't work that smooth.
Absolutely. So for those online that didn't hear that, so the comment was about compatibility of mixing these different chemicals together, and that absolutely can be an issue. And that's why it's important to ask questions of the manufacturers, right? When you're thinking about mixing things together, it's important to do jar tests and make sure they're going to work, right? It's important to pay attention to all those, unfortunately, reading the label, right? Those finicky things on the label that tell you the order in which to mix things and how to do it properly. And yes, it can be a pretty big challenge. I think it's easier with the pre, right, when we're looking at these pre's, than it is with our posts, because the posts have such a high level of need for those extra adjuvants like the DRAs, right, and surfactants, and right, like the Enlist label's got what, a DRA, and it's got a MSO, like Corteva wants you to use MSO with it and things, right? So I think it's easier with the pre's, but it's important to do that testing. Okay, and so it's not just herbicides, just as you noted, right? There's a lot of other things going on. So I think with pre-emergence control, the big thing is the rates, right? Making sure that we're choosing products at appropriate rates to control our weeds. And then with post-emergence, I think the big thing that we miss a lot of times is the timing. Right, we're sitting there, either we're waiting for more weeds to control, or the weather's not quite right, and we just missed the boat a little bit, right? We've got 6-inch weeds instead of 3-inch weeds. But there's a lot of other things going on, right? We want to make sure that if we're only using a pre-product that doesn't have burn down, that we have a pretty weed-free seed bed when we're starting. That's how we need to start our season. The timing of those is also important. Post-emergence, spray carrier volume, if you're at anything less than 15, I'm wondering what is going on, because 15 to 20 is where we need to be in pretty much every case right now. Making sure that we're using the right nozzles to choose, right? Getting good spray coverage, right? Making sure that if you are using Liberty, you're paying attention to the fact that the label says, right? I believe it's medium to coarse droplet size, right? Not those dicamba nozzles that we got free from Bayer that are producing ultra coarse droplet sizes. That is not doing us any favors as far as weed control goes, right? At least not with products that we don't need to be using it with. And then adjuvants, of course, right? Making sure that we are following the label to choose the proper surfactant to be included. If we need a DRA, use a DRA. Using AMS is hugely important, especially as we look toward the Liberty type products. But that's not it. That's not going to save us. I'm not here to be your savior telling you to use your herbicides better, right? We got to be able to preserve our herbicides and make sure they work well long into the future. So using a diversity of weed management tactics is imperative, absolutely necessary. Narrow row spacing, cover crops, crop rotation, tillage, right? The soil conservationists don't like when I say that, but we've got good technology, right? We can do these things in targeted ways in a way that we couldn't do in the 80s, when some of these things, right, when we were looking at using tillage initially, right? Are there other things that we can do to preserve herbicide efficacy? Is there anything that you're doing on your farm? Yes.
So we do a really good job of talking about what you spray, how much you spray, what stage you spray, how you spray. And the one thing, if you ask what else can we do that I know works, that no one wants to do, is what time of day you spray, which is actually a misnomer. The best time to spray when the plant is most open to business is overnight.
Interesting. So he said that we don't talk enough about what time of day we're spraying, and says that overnight is right when the plant's open for business. The challenge is that so many of our herbicides rely on active photosynthesis to be happening, right, to be really effective. And so that's where we say, you know, sunny day, warm conditions. For things like Liberty, right, glufosinate, that's a really big one, that's what the research says is beneficial to it. I'm not sure about other products. That's a good thought, though.
Is the research done overnight?
I don't know. That's a good question. I would have to look if they did research in evening conditions, right? Low light conditions. I'm certain they did research work. Researchers have done work in low light conditions. Yeah, I mean, I think time of day is super important. I think there's other things that we don't talk about very much, right? pH of the spray, temperature of the water, right? There's all kinds of things that are going to affect this. But herbicides aren't going to save us, so this is only going to get us so far. And this is where we need to think about these other tactics, right? And so something that I think a lot of people have been doing is researching cover crops. And they fit fairly well with soybeans. And I like to think that, I'm sure everyone in this room's like, oh, that's not going to work for me, right? Not going to work on my soils. And I'm in central Iowa, where we really love our tillage. And we have very flat, very wet soils. And so I understand. I'm with you. But I think if somebody has the will to make it work, they can make it work. And it can work really effectively. And we don't have to grow like this, right? Like, you don't have to have cereal rye as tall as me to get effective weed suppression out of that cereal rye. And so the goal, right, is kind of this 4,000, 4,500, 5,000 pounds per acre. A lot of research work has shown that like 4,000 or so pounds per acre is pretty good to get some substantial weed suppression out of. And so this is just some work that was done in Iowa where they looked at several herbicide programs, right? So this is no cover crop, prefix, and Liberty Post, no cover crop, prefix and Liberty Post, no cover crop Liberty Post. And so, oh, sorry, this is prefix and Liberty Post. This was the prefix as the pre and Liberty Post. And so comparing no cover crop to cover crop, and that's a pretty marginal herbicide program, right? If we're going to talk about herbicide programs, those are not great options. But what we do see is that we see a substantial difference in the number of water hemp just comparing this, like this one and this one, this one and this one, and then this one and that one, right? That cover crop is doing a good job no matter the herbicide program that we chose, right? We can choose a better herbicide program to work with that cover crop, but the cover crop made a big difference, right? It essentially cut the number of water hemp that we're dealing with in basically every case in half. So think of that as like a kind of marginal pre-herbicide program, right? Like it's not going to solve a problem, right? It's not the answer, but it's an answer that can help. Controlling weed escapes prior to seed set is very important. Someone sort of jokingly said walking fields, but it's no joke, right? Especially if you're somebody who has pretty clean fields overall. Like, I would absolutely not want those few little water hemp that escape to go to seed. There's a guy that lives just, I don't know, probably like 6 miles from me. He's got a couple fields right on either side of a really well-traveled highway. And he's always the literal first person in the field, right? Like if I want to go find the first person to plant, it's this guy. And last summer, I drove by and he was out with a hoe because he's right on the highway and he has really clean fields. And if he can see the water hemp above the canopy, he's getting rid of them because everybody else notices it too going down the highway. He has just impeccably clean fields. And now I know exactly why. It's because he's going out and hoeing on like 90-degree days. Right, preventing seed from entering the seed banks, the only way to prevent resistant traits from spreading. Anybody seen this before? Right, the zappers. So we're gonna go through a couple other tactics, right? We know tillage, right? We know cultivation, we know the row spacing, but the zapper, for example, is an additional weed cleanup, right? Maybe a more efficient way to clean up those weeds than going and walking, depending on how many you've got. And so this was some water hemp control work that was done at the University of Missouri by a grad student in Kevin Bradley's group. And you can see here that this is, I chose only 3 of the growth stages that they looked at and looked at the percent control. And this is, the red is 7 days after treatment and the yellow is 42 days after treatment. And so basically each of these, the 7 and 42 days, they were not significantly different from each other, but these were, right? So at R6, they got close to 100% weed control, right? Maybe 90% weed control, water hemp control. At that R6 time frame, it actually can help prevent basically mature seed from entering the seed soil or entering the soil in the seed bank, and it's to clean up, right? This isn't like a weed control tool. You're not using this in the absence of herbicides or anything, but it's an excellent way to clean up fields.
Do the weeds have to be above the canopy?
Do the weeds have to be above the canopy? Yes, that's why this is a cleanup tool. If the weeds are in the canopy, it's much harder to A, get contact with them, and B, avoid the soybeans, because if you contact the soybeans, believe me, if it causes 100% control on water hemp or almost 100% control, you are also affecting the soybeans. And so I think they saw, depending on the treatment, they did see like up to 15 or 20% yield loss, like when the water hemp were in that canopy and they were getting a lot of contact with it. So we can have problems with it. It's not perfect, but it's a good cleanup tool. We need to make sure we reduce the influx of weed seed into crop fields. And again, these are just uncomfortable things to talk about. People don't like this. Manage weeds in field edges. Do we do an okay job of that? Oh, I'm getting like a no, emphatic no. Okay. I mean, I think people try, right? I think the challenge is that like the time that you need to control the weeds in the field edges is when you want to kill the weeds in the field. And by the time you get back and pay special attention to those field edges, they're like 4 times too big off-label, right? And so focusing on those field edges to keep new things from coming in is important. Cleaning equipment between fields or harvesting fields that are the weediest last. Does anybody consider doing that? Do you harvest weedy fields last? Or avoid weedy areas in fields during harvest? So our combines are very effective seed spreaders. Right, so this is an example of a chaff lining mechanism. So it's basically a big metal chute that's put at the bottom. You put a baffle in here so that all the chaff drops. And so if there's anybody who's no-till, this is a really great opportunity to try to manage your weeds better. It doesn't eliminate the seed from entering the seed bank, but you end up with a huge percentage of that weed seed right in this area. So first of all, that chaff helps suppress those weeds. And then it provides you a very specific area to control them, right? So if 90% of your weed seed comes up in one 30-inch spacing, right, every 30 feet or however wide your head is, that makes them a lot easier to manage, right? You use a lot less chemical to do that if you're willing to go to the work. Other things are the mills, right? Harvest weed seed control. Right, so seed terminator, seed destructor. This is an example of what the Ready Cop looks like, right? So they're very high-powered spinning mills that essentially throw the seed around and crush it before it exits the combine in the chaff. And so there's a few questions that people have about it that type of technology, one of which is, well, are there even weed seeds still on the plants at the time we combine? Right? The weed seed needs to be on the plants to go into the combine in order for us to kill them with these mills? And the answer is yes, they definitely are. So at the time of soybean harvest, especially when we're looking at late September, we could still have more than 3/4 of that seed on the plants. That's good news for technologies like this. That's bad news if you're not using technology like this, because you know every water hemp plant you go pull into that combine in a soybean field, that seed is coming back out the back, or a great majority of it is. And so one of the questions that we have is how much of that seed actually gets shattered on the head versus gets in the combine. And some research in Iowa says there's quite a bit of it that shatters, right? So 17% in 2021 and 9% in 2022. But that still means that you've got like 80 to 90% of the seed getting in the combine versus shattering off that head. And so after they go through a mill, this is what the variety of seeds can look like, right? We've got anything from totally crushed, obliterated, severely damaged, moderately damaged, and then there's a few that will make it out with no damage. But what does it mean for germination? Overall, 87% destruction of the seed that gets in the combine with the Ready Cop mill in Iowa. So in 2021 and then in 2022, you can see 2022, it was a lot weedier. So in the absence of the weed seed destructor, they had over 23,000 seeds that germinated that came out of the combine in their sample. And when that terminator was running, they only had 2,000, so they reduced it by essentially 90%. So technology, like herbicides won't save us, but maybe technology will. Or we hope it will, because if it doesn't, then we're in big trouble. And so I'm just repeating what I said already, right? Water hemp is developing resistance faster than we develop new herbicides. We have got to tailor these weed management programs better to manage water hemp, right? And that includes paying closer attention to what herbicides we're putting out on the field. But it has to include some type of other technology, or we're just gonna be on this like herbicide treadmill and the weed issues are just gonna keep getting worse. So I think I have just a little time for questions. If anybody has any questions or any tomatoes to throw, perhaps anything.
I had an anonymous question from the audience.
An anonymous question from the audience. This should be good.
No, just a comment. So I know some of the example products that you talked about in corn and talked about pushing higher rates. Is safety an issue with some of those products that carry over in corn?
Next question, please. So one of the question, to repeat, was about higher rates for some of these products and whether or not safety could be an issue in corn or carryover. Absolutely, there are always concerns, right? Some products more than others, right? Most of the products that we use in season for the crop, if it's a labeled rate for your soil type, it's going to be pretty darn safe, right? There are scenarios, and that's where you want to talk with an agronomist, because there are scenarios where somebody local may be able to say, look, you know, like, yeah, this is the highest rate, but this is probably the safest highest rate for you, right? Like my farmer A, he had 12 ounces of sulfentrazone, and we talked about that for a long time because 12 ounces is higher than I usually recommend 10 as the full rate for our soil types. And so we talked through the risk and the benefit of that and why he might want to be one way versus another. Carryover is always a potential problem. I think very rarely is a concern for carryover a reason to change your herbicide program plan. Because we have to kill water hemp. Like, that's period. End of sentence. And carryover is a risk. But if you're using rates that are appropriate for your soil type, carryover is often going to be a fluke. And it's generally going to be in places like overlap areas or areas that are already under extremely high stress. So, I mean, like, in my area, we've had a lot more carryover in recent years. But we have a lot of people trying to do one pass posts in corn, like end of May, which looks a lot different than using some of these products as a pre in the middle of April, right? And so timing of product application, following those labels for rotation restrictions, all that's really important.
But as we're trying to implement cover crops into our systems earlier and earlier, to put that, that grain down and that cover, these cover overs are huge. And to get to some of the rates that we're talking about that we believe we need for weed suppression and not letting that germinate, I think that's kind of what she was getting at, or what we're getting at here.
Yeah, so carry over to go to cover crops is also
such a fine line.
Yeah, yes, and it's absolutely a fine line and something to be concerned with. I think it's fairly low risk for, like if you're going for weed suppression, you're going to look at something like a cereal rye, and that is one of the most tolerant options that we have for most of these herbicide products anyway. I think the person who's going to be much more likely to run into issues with the cover crop is going to be, if you are in a severe drought, in which case I'm not certain you'd be able to germinate it very well in the fall anyway, or B, if you're trying to go out with some like 9-way mix, right, in which case then your goal isn't necessarily weed suppression. You're looking for some other type of goal, and maybe you want to tailor your herbicide program a little bit differently. There are probably some ways that we could pick products, individual active ingredients within these herbicide groups that are going to have different residuals, but I don't know that there's a lot of research work to say, yeah, we're going to be super successful with a 9-way mix or however many species anyway. And so, right, I have that like one-track mind of where can I get my biggest bang for my buck with a cover crop, and at least in my geography, it's not going to be with like some huge mix unless I have cattle or something, in which case then I'm violating these labels anyway. It's going to be trying to get weed suppression or trying to get feed value in the spring in the form of growing something big and harvesting it before I plant, or just growing it big so that I can suppress weeds. Okay, I'm looking around. Any other questions?
There's somewhere to find like herbicide compatibility charts?
Ooh, is there somewhere to find herbicide compatibility charts? I'm looking around. Does anybody know? I'm not aware of any specific herbicide compatibility charts. No, I am a big fan of getting somebody else to test it for you and tell you. Yeah, jar tests are great. Yeah, jar tests are an excellent way to get an idea of what is going to work together and relying on others' experience, right? If you go in and you say, hey, I want to spike my premix this spring in soybeans with more sulfentrazone, odds are pretty good that you show up at the co-op and you're not the first person who had that idea, right? They've got somebody else who's already done that. There's tons of people doing things like that. And so odds are pretty good that you can rely on some other people's experience too to know if it'll work. But I do know that like even, I don't know if you've had this issue, but we've had issues sometimes with product quality differing, especially during the pandemic, right? Where one year something worked well and the next year it didn't work as well. Not necessarily with pre-mixing herbicides together, but with mixing different things in. I'm not going to get any more specific than that because I'm being broadcast, but we can talk about that if you want. Yes.
So a pre-merged herbicide's life is based on temperature and moisture, how long it's going to be effective control. As we move to planting beans earlier and putting a pre on middle of April, we're running out of that residual.
Next question. Sorry. Yeah.
Hager has done some work on it too. That was ISA.
Yes. So the pre-emergence herbicides are going to be dictated by the half-life, the longevity of the product. That's just a chemically different between different products. Temperature, moisture, right? How fast things break down. And planting earlier, it presents a huge weed management challenge. And I really don't think we've done enough work looking at this yet. I think that there needs to be a lot more work looking at what does the effectiveness of this pre look like, especially against water hemp, which we know won't emerge typically until late April, early May at the earliest often, when we are trying to put these pre's out on 5th of April, 10th of April, whatever it is, right, when we get our soybeans planted, because we are planting them so early. And that's all the more reason to make sure that when we're going out there, we're not going out with cut rates to start with. But the timing of it is going to be a huge issue in getting effectiveness of control. So it's this whole balance of like, are we actually going to get earlier canopy to help add suppression of these weeds so that we don't need as long, we don't need those herbicides to work for as long? Because 30 days to do your post after your pre looks a lot different if your post is on May 10th than if your post is on, you know, May 28th or something, right? Like, that's a big difference in application timing. I wish I had like an answer. 3-pass system, that's your answer. Nobody wants to hear that either. Yeah, except for people selling product. There you go. Okay. All right, have I used up all my time? I think I did.
Yeah, you're good. You're perfect.
Okay. Thank you all for having me. I'll stick around for a while if you want to chat. I appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Deanna is going to help get us set up here for the next session. So thank you so much, Meaghan, for traveling here and for your presentation today. Our next speaker is Dr. Martin Chilvers. He earned his Bachelor's of Agricultural Science degree with honors and PhD from the University of Tasmania, Australia, with subsequent postdoctoral training at Washington State University. Dr. Chilvers began his position with Michigan State University in 2008, where he leads a field crop pathology program, researching plant diseases and managing solutions. Let's welcome Dr. Chilvers.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephanie. Good morning, everybody. As we go through this, if you have a question, please sing out. I'd much rather have a bit more of a conversation than just talking at you. A big shout out to the various checkoff boards that, you know, we wouldn't be able to do our work without the support, be it the national or the state checkoff boards. So, yeah, thank you very much for that. So I'm going to talk about a few different disease issues. If there's something that you want me to talk about, again, please ask. Or if you think I'm going too slow or too fast, don't hesitate to sing out. Anyone know what this is? I saw quite a bit of that this past year in 23. Any guesses?
Soybean vein.
Yeah, that's not fair. You worked in a diagnostic clinic. Anyone else?
She said it quietly.
Yeah, she did say it quietly. It's spread by thrips, dry seasons. We really freaked out in 2012. We're like, oh my goodness, another disease. And it was everywhere because we had that drought in 2012. So the thrips really took off. No guesses at all? Come on. Someone knows the answer.
That's what she said.
What she said? Okay, the colours, okay, I'll give it to you. The screen's a little small, the colours are a bit off. So soybean vein necrosis virus. Does that ring any bells? Yeah? Maybe? Nothing? Does it ring any bells?
Very prominent this year.
Yeah, very prominent. All right. So there was a lot of it out there. So that's why I put it up there. It's just one of those things. I saw a lot of it out there. And I went through our clinic as well. We sent it off just to double check with ELISA. And yes, sure enough, it lit up. It can look a little different from time to time, but just as the name suggests, necrosis around the veins of the soybean plant. And it's transmitted via thrips. So when we have dry conditions, that's when we tend to see more of it. In terms of yield loss, we really haven't seen a great deal. Maybe a small effect on seed quality. I don't know, Seth, if you've done anything on that. We were really freaked out in 2012, again, because I was like, oh, great, another thing to worry about, because it was everywhere. We could find it in every field. But since then, it's been relatively quiet. All right, soybean vein necrosis virus, there you go.
Are they vectoring that all season long, early season? When's the most?
Yeah, well, so when are the thrips vectoring that? I believe all season long. So it's a Tospo virus, I can remember that much, and I think it is it'll stay in the system of that thrips for a period of time. Yeah, so I think one of the big things, if you have a lot of thrip pressure because of the conditions, they're going to pick that up, and then they're just going to be vectoring it around, and yes, throughout the season.
I guess the biggest question I get is it going to affect yield?
Yeah, so the biggest question Stephanie says she gets is, is it going to affect yield? And generally I'd say no. We just don't see enough, necrosis on the plants. Again, we were really worried in 2012, so we were starting to sort of get things ready to answer these types of questions, and it just really didn't develop post-2012 into significant levels anyway. Oh, so there's my slide on weather. So I know we're going to talk about soybeans, just the one thing on corn, I guess. I got asked a lot, so where did all the tar spot go in Michigan? So yes, I'm Marty Chilvers in the field crop pathologist, right, in Michigan State. I know I got a good introduction, but up there in Michigan, we had a lot of questions about, it's really wet in July and August, where's the tar spot, where's the damage? Any ideas why we didn't see a lot of tar spot this past year? Yeah, moisture driven, absolutely. So yes, the conditions was very, very favourable in July and August, without a doubt. But we just didn't have that initial transmission from debris onto plants to get disease started. At least that's my theory, and I think that's pretty reasonable. Happy to be told otherwise and proven otherwise. But yeah, that dry May and June, we didn't detect tar spot in some of our fields until August, and we're paying pretty close attention. I know you found it really early. You found it, what, June 25th? June 25th, so you have the record for that then?
Not me personally.
Well, someone has a record, right, in Iowa. So I'd found it on July 1st in 2021, and that was a really bad epidemic for us in Michigan. And when I found it, actually, it was in a variety trial, and it was on 50% of the plants. It was all, so we're out scouting for it. I'm going to look at the lowest green leaf on those young plants, right? So we were at, I don't know, V8, 9, 10-ish, and it was on 50% of the plants. So clearly it had been there for a bit before I'd seen it, right? It's a hard one to scout for because it's just those tiny little spots on the plant. So it's a challenging one. So I have no doubt that it's probably out there early. It's just sort of hard to scout for. And let me get back to the soybean element here. And so tar spot is what we call a polycyclic disease, right? It'll infect a plant, make more spores, go through another cycle, infect the plant all through the season, right? So hopefully, like compound interest used to be, you put money in the bank and you can see it grow, right? So that's what happens with tar spot. If it gets started early and we have favourable conditions, it can grow and we can have those runaway, disasters. Yeah, so anyway, I think that's what really happened with the tar spot. We're just too dry too early for too long and we just didn't get things started. It definitely came in later, but yield losses were pretty minimal this year. So let's think about white mold. And we had a lot of ear mold as well. So just finish on corn, I swear. Your corn's okay? All right. I know, some of the commodity groups get a bit funny with each other. But, okay, in terms of ear mold, we had some really significant ear mold issues in Michigan. There's a few factors going on. So your uneven emergence, we've got silking, prolonged silking and silking at different times, that element of it. But also we had all that rainfall during silking. So we had ideal moisture, humidity conditions for infections of those silks. So sort of not the west side of Michigan, but pretty much everywhere else, we had some very heavy ear molds, and it was primarily all through that silk channel. So right in central Michigan there on campus, we were pulling back husks and tip after tip disease. So yeah, some very high levels. But similar to white mold, that's also what we call a monocyclic disease. It's going to infect through the flowers, right? And although it was dry, early on, and we're all really worried, at least in Michigan, about the rainfall or lack of rainfall and soil moistures that we had we had enough moisture come in at the end of June that we had soybean canopy closure, and canopy closure is a really important piece for white mold development. And then, of course, those wet infection conditions, those white mold mushrooms releasing those spores and then infecting the flowers. And so we had some pretty epic white mold levels in the state of Michigan too, and I'll touch on that in a minute. So let's talk about Phytophthora to start with. So this is, a PhD student went through my lab and did his PhD project on this particular issue. So just a quick reminder, I know this is kind of hard to see, but essentially Phytophthora can hang out in the soil for years. They produce these little spores called oospores, and they survive for many, many years in the soil. They'll actually germinate and release these little spores called zoospores, and these zoospores can actually sniff out your soybean plants and swim towards your soybean plants. So as the soybean plant is growing, it's releasing exudates out of the root, and this Phytophthora pathogen can smell that and will actually try and move towards that for infection of the plant. Okay, that's essentially the take-home message that you need to realise from this figure. Okay, so how do we go about managing Phytophthora root rot? There's a couple of things we can do. So on the genetic side, there's actually two parts that we need to be aware of, and they show up in the seed catalogues, right? There'll be a Phytophthora resistance gene. Very commonly, you would have seen Phytophthora resistance gene 1K. It's one of the most common ones, or 1C, right? Some of those genes showing up in the book. And then the other one might be like a field tolerance to Phytophthora. Okay, so they're describing different genetic mechanisms of resistance. So that 1K essentially gives you, if it's working, that gene, it'll give you complete resistance, okay? But the pathogen can overcome that, and we'll talk about what we found. And the other type of resistance is that tolerance score. That's much, much harder for that Phytophthora pathogen to overcome in terms of breaking down that resistance type, but there are a couple of the genetic elements. And then, of course, we have seed treatments, and there's a lot more on the market now than what there were 5 or so years ago. It used to pretty much be mefenoxam or metalaxyl. That was pretty much it. But there's a lot of other products out there now, ethoboxam, oxythiopropylene, so Lumicina, Integro, and ethoboxam as well. So anyway, a lot of different products. In terms of tillage, that's really challenging. I think the most important thing culturally, otherwise, is drainage if possible. So, good drainage of fields can assist with Phytophthora. All right, so what we conducted in Michigan was a survey to figure out which resistance genes, so like the RPS1C or RPS1K that you see in the catalogue, which of those genes are still effective? So that was a primary question. We did some fungicide sensitivity work as well, and we can chat about that. So we went across the state, and yes, I'm talking about Michigan, but essentially we found the same thing in Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, everywhere else around the country. So we went out, we collected soil. We go through this really, it's not an easy process. It takes considerable effort. So through those soil samples, we have to sort of incubate and prepare those soil samples so that the Phytophthora will come out. So we incubate them, and then we put in a susceptible soybean variety that has none of those resistance genes, none of those RPS resistance genes. And when it infects that soybean plant, we go ahead and do an isolation. So we get this Phytophthora organism out into plates that we can then work with. So it's incredibly involved. So if you've got a field, you want to figure out what types of Phytophthora you have in your soil, it just takes an incredible amount of effort to do that at this point in time. Then once we have those isolates, we actually take a panel of different soybean varieties or germplasm lines that have these different resistance genes, these different RPS genes. And we use a little syringe, and we cut the soybean and squirt in some of the Phytophthora, and then basically rate, you know, like a resistant reaction. So that tells us that that resistance gene is working. Or we get a reaction where we get death of that seedling, and that shows us that that Phytophthora can actually overcome that resistance gene that we're screening for. So this is a cartoon representation. So we have 14 different differentials out there. So we have a check here, so a soybean variety with no resistance genes. This is just to really make sure that our assay is working. So if our Phytophthora is not killing this, then something's wrong with the system. Something's not working right. So we expect 100% death here, and then basically all of these different genes that we have available. So RPS 1A, 1B, 1C, 1K, which are some of the very widely deployed resistance genes. 3A, 3B, and so on, right? So in this cartoon, it's basically just representing what we would see in a particular screen. So in this instance, unfortunately, 1K and 1C didn't do anything. That Phytophthora Soj was just able to overcome that resistance gene. 3A, 3C, and 4 were working, so we didn't kill that soybean plant. So we did that for 100 or so isolates of Phytophthora from around the state of Michigan. And we were fortunate because a study was done about 20 years ago, the exact same type of study, and this is what they found. So what we're looking at here, the high bars are bad, basically, right? This is the opposite of the way Meaghan was showing it. So all of the isolates here with our check that has no resistance genes were able to kill those plants. And here's the scores for other things. So 20 years ago, RPS 1B controlled, only about 20% of the isolates were able to kill the RPS 1B. Only about 30% of the Phytophthora isolates were able to kill the 1K, etc. Right? So it's showing that these genes were killed sometimes, but not by most of the population. And what we're talking about here is like 100 or so Phytophthora isolates, right? So it's a whole sort of population scale. So when we repeated it, unfortunately, there'd been a shift. So 20 years later, in 2022, these genes that were effective before, and only a few of the Phytophthora isolates were able to kill, now they're able to kill most of those. Right? So it's showing us that the RPS 1K was effective 20 years ago. It controlled about 70 or 60% of the isolates out there, but now it's controlling very, very few. Most of the isolates of Phytophthora Soj are able to kill soybean varieties with that resistance gene. We did find that this RPS 3A, which is available, I think with all seed companies now pretty much, not most of the varieties, but some of your varieties do have 3A, and it's effective for most of the Phytophthora Soj isolates that are out there. Does anybody have any questions about this? Does this make sense? Am I explaining the story well enough? Yeah, I'm getting some nods. That's good. All right. So the other thing we looked at, and this is a little bit academic, but it does actually matter, is essentially how many of those resistance genes in the soybeans can we overcome when we look at the Phytophthora that's out there. So again, 20 years ago, this is sort of what things look like. So, this is a percentage of the population of Phytophthora that's able to overcome 1 gene, 2 genes, 3 genes, 4 genes, 5 genes, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 resistance genes. Okay? So 20 years ago, that was the case. And then here's sort of today. So the short of this is it's bad. These Phytophthora are now able to overcome, the population is able to overcome more of those soybean resistance genes than in the past. Okay, we've had a shift up. Okay, so we've talked about resistance genes. So those in the catalogue, the 1C, 1K, 3, okay, and how they're important. Here's sort of a good story. This was back in a couple of years ago anyway. We had some pretty heavy rainfall events and it really pushed the Phytophthora out in the west side of Michigan. So, you know, going around with the farmer, trying to figure out what's going on, like what can we do to help here. It turned out both of the varieties had the RPS1K gene. Okay, so this gene that's pretty much not very effective anymore. It might maybe control like 5% or so of the population of Phytophthora that's out there across the state and in fields. But for the most part, it's really not doing anything. In the seed catalogue, the varieties actually had the same field tolerance score. But when we called up and spoke to the agronomist for that company, they're like, oh, yeah, I know, like this bean here has a good field tolerance score, and this one has a poor tolerance score. So the message here is, if you've been dealing with Phytophthora, please talk to your seed dealer, and please ask the questions about how, you know, I've got this being sold this great, you know, high-yielding soybean variety. Awesome, that's really cool. I know I have Phytophthora issues. What do you know about the Phytophthora resistance? How is the field tolerance score? Is it poor? Is it good? We need to know that in terms of trying to make some decisions for managing Phytophthora. And here was the difference. You can see those two varieties sort of stripped across the field. Obviously, it's pretty rough because we did have some anoxic conditions, but Phytophthora was definitely in there. And there was about a $7 a bushel difference at the end of the season between those varieties, just through a soybean variety that had good tolerance against Phytophthora. Any questions on that or comments? Yeah.
This is a disease, you know, sudden death, white mold are hot topics.
Uh-huh.
I hear a few people talking about Phytophthora. Do you think this is a brewing problem we'll deal with more in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question was, there's other diseases that tend to share most of the spotlight, right? We don't talk about Phytophthora much. If we're in Ohio, we better damn well be talking about Phytophthora, right? And I think a lot of that is just to do with the soil types, topography, quite flat. We hold moisture. I'm sure there's parts of the state around here that are going to be more susceptible to Phytophthora than others, and I'm not, you guys fill me in if I'm missing something here. And it's the same in Michigan. Phytophthora is very important, without a doubt. Our bigger issue tends to be white mold, but we can't, obviously, you know, we can't forget about it when we're seeing, you know, differences in yield at the end of the season in terms of, yeah, the damage being done.
Could it be the disease triangle first off this year?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the other element there, right, from year to year, we're going to see different issues, right? So yeah, you're not going to see necessarily Phytophthora every year. Ohio, again, tends to maybe see it more often than maybe in this part of the country. Again, just due to soil type and whatnot, and that, you know, those conditions being met for disease. You had a question too?
Yeah, so I saw quite a lot of Phytophthora this year, which surprised me because it was so dry.
Mm-hmm.
Can you?
Yeah, that's it. Okay, that's a good question too. So, and I had my colleague in Ohio have the same question, and they basically blamed the smoke. You're going to talk about smoke. Then those bloody Canadians, right, sending their smoke down here and wrecking everything. So, yeah, so Phytophthora can infect the plant at any point during the season. So yes, if we had dry conditions early, doesn't mean we're necessarily going to escape Phytophthora. If we get, you know, heavy rainfall events, flooding events, Phytophthora is going to love that and come in. And I think we tend to see sort of classic Phytophthora sort of in July is typically when we'll see those classic symptoms where we have a lesion moving up the side of the plant. We're like, that's Phytophthora. But I think earlier in the season, I can't tell you if it's Phytophthora, Pythium, or Fusarium. It's so hard without diagnostics. So I think that's part of the whole thing of like, is it Phytophthora? If you don't know, get a sample, get it into a clinic too to help try and get some answers on that.
We had a very heavy rain, especially here in areas at the end of June and beginning of July.
Right, so Stephanie's just saying, it's heavy rainfall at the end of June. So that can help drive that Phytophthora. And even if there's some infection of the plants, that'll help really push things along and it can cycle and become more of an issue.
We saw it in July.
You guys saw it in July too?
Like big soybean plants.
Yeah, okay. And that's the classic. That's like, oh, okay, that's definitely Phytophthora. I know what it is. I can give you an answer. That's easy, right?
It was pretty much all across the Midwest. It was
yeah.
after that big rain went through, and then later on showed up in July.
Yep.
We got a lot of questions on it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a question I'm back to.
So at the top of the screen, the beans change color dramatically.
Yeah, they do, don't they?
Anything on that? Is that a disease presence, a fertility difference, or just plain that much drier?
You know, I don't even know if there was a topography difference in that part of the field. I didn't dig further into that.
You still see the difference between the varieties.
Yeah, you're right. I hadn't actually noted that before, but yeah, there's definitely a strip up the top there. I don't know. Be interesting to look at. Yeah. I mean, you know, one of the issues with diseases too, there's always patchiness throughout a field, right? They don't tend to be uniform across a field. Yeah. Okay, so the other thing we did in the lab too, and some of this data doesn't matter too much to you, but we took these different chemistries. So as I was saying before, well, the metalaxyl mefenoxam, there has been some discussion that, oh, it's failing, we're seeing resistance in Phytophthora, but there's no data that I'm aware of to really demonstrate that. So we went and had a look, and the isolates, at least in Michigan, were able to demonstrate that they were all sensitive. So what you're looking at here is basically the dose of fungicide to inhibit growth by 50%. So as we go up the scale, we get more and more fungicide in a Petri plate, and we're putting that organism on the seed growth. This oxythiopripyline from the Lumicina looks amazing, right? Like a very, very low dose. But you've got to be careful how you read this. This is in a Petri plate. So how does this product move in plant? How long does it viable in planter? There's a whole bunch of other elements to sort of think about here. But essentially we found no cause for concern in terms of fungicide resistance in the Phytophthora that we looked at. I'm assuming that it'd be the same, very, very similar situation here in Illinois. But it's something that we need to be certainly paying attention to. So just the summary points then. So if you're looking in, you know, if you're dealing with Phytophthora, you want to be very aware that even though it says it's got a resistance gene, 1C and 1K in the book, it doesn't mean that that gene's actually going to do anything, because most of the Phytophthora isolates are able to overcome those genes. RPS3A controls about 70% of the isolates out there. So it's not perfect either, but it does a pretty damn good job. And we just did I'm not talking about it now, but we did a global analysis. So we pulled all of the data, all of these surveys that we've done across the US, Canada. We pulled data from around the world as well. And it basically shows the same story. Most of these genes, these 1C and 1K genes, tend to be failing globally. And for us, it was really just a way to put that message out directly in front of the seed companies to go, hey, if Phytophthora is an issue, we need to incorporate some of these different resistance genes, okay? And just because you listed 1K in your catalogue shouldn't really give farmers much reassurance. Any other comments or questions about Phytophthora before we move on to white mold? All right. Okay, so we had some pretty significant white mold in Michigan this past year. And I think for us, honestly, there's always somewhere in the state that tends to get knocked about because we have lake effect moisture, and we do have, you know, some irrigation as well, so that certainly promotes things. So this was fairly close to Lansing, and yeah, the field is pretty well smoked there with white mold. What was interesting and really reassuring, we went around with this seed company that had different varieties in different fields, and thankfully what was nice to see is that there was some correlation between the field, the book resistance score, the white mold resistance score, and how much disease we were seeing. So this was a variety that did not get a very good white mold resistance score, and it looked terrible. We looked in other fields where another variety had a much better resistance to white mold, and it still had disease, but things looked way, way better. So that was just nice to see, because they don't always, you know, they don't always sort of correlate. But that was really reassuring to see that book score mattered. So in terms of thinking about fungicide applications for white mold management, there's this Sporecaster. Are you all familiar with Sporecaster? Anyone familiar? A few of you guys, so about 20% or so. So this Sporecaster app is free to download on iPhone or Android. So my colleague Damon Smith at University of Wisconsin-Madison put this app together and the modeling work behind that. We helped out by providing data. And essentially what this model does is for a GPS coordinate, we open up the app right here, it'll pull here, but you can push it around wherever you want. It'll pull weather data down and run an algorithm based on weather data to predict your risk of white mold. And the actual risk that it's predicting is the likelihood of seeing these white mold mushrooms in the field. Okay, not final disease, but it was based around prediction of these white mold mushrooms. And if you're seeing these white mold mushrooms, or apothecia is the correct name, but if you're seeing that tends to correlate with disease development. So it's quite a handy app, and it's, you know, these types of models every year, you know, we do updates with new data that we get in from the different seasons. So I just ran that model at a couple of different locations. I ran it for last year in 2022 and just to sort of verify like how well was it working. And sure enough, it caught things. So what we're looking at here in terms of trying to make that decision, like, are we at high risk? Should I think about a fungicide application? We had this threshold of 40%. Okay, so in 22, mid-July and end of July, we were below 40%, so we were like what we would consider medium to low risk, maybe not worth spraying a fungicide. But 2023, we were at high risk, and it caught that. And so I'm glad the model did do that. That was reassuring. And just another location, same thing, the model tripped when it should have tripped. We have done about 10 years now of white mold trials, and we use a farm, a Michigan State farm, that does have irrigation, and that's great because we want to obviously, I don't want to put a whole bunch of effort into putting varieties and fungicides out and see no white mold development. So we have irrigation to supplement the environment, you know, if it does turn dry. The other thing that we have going for us in terms of the opposite of what you guys want, we have a really good load of sclerotia, those white mold sclerotia resting bodies in the soil here. We've had a history of dry bean and potato production here, and the soil is just loaded with these white mold little black sclerotia resting bodies. So we're pretty much assured of pretty decent disease pressure, which is great, because we can take varieties and screen them for resistance or put out fungicides or other treatments and see how things are performing. I'm just going to show you a couple of charts. We have some summary slides as well, looking at these various products. So this is a 21 trial, and pretty much every year we see that Endura fungicide is like sort of one of the, it's kind of like a gold standard product. There's certainly other products that look very, very similar as well, but Endura tends to sort of come to the top of the pack. We've been looking at some of these slightly newer products like Delaro Complete and seeing how well that performs. And what you're looking at here is yield in blue, and I've just ordered the treatments by yield, so the highest yielding at the top down to the lowest. And we've got our untreated check here. So Miravis Neo might be a fine fungicide for other plant health benefits, if we want to get into that, or controlling other diseases. But I would not recommend it for white mold management. We just have not seen that perform for white mold management. So the message here as well, I'm not trying to tell you that Miravis Neo sucks or anything like that. What I'm saying is that you've got to be aware of what products you're going to use. We have some fungicide efficacy charts that are available. We update those every year to tell you how we see these various products working, okay? And we look at some of these older products too, like this Topsin product, which is an older chemistry. It's cheaper, so can we use that at a higher rate and get reasonable control or not? Here's another year of data. And I put this slide in because The other thing, if you're really struggling, is anybody or anybody's neighbours have white mould? Might be the way to ask that question. Yeah, some of the neighbours have white mould. Yeah, those buggers. All right, so if you're really struggling with white mould, if you like, willing to bet you're going to get white mould, it's really a big issue, I would have a look at Cobra as a potential option. So Cobra, the herbicide.
Rescue application.
Oh, okay, rescue application. All right. So we went 8 fluid ounces there. I don't know where that's in terms of weed management rates, maybe a little bit light. I think the actual product label for disease for white, so it's got a label for white mold as well. And I think that labeled rate is actually 6 fluid ounces. We ran that. This is an example of it being run at 8 fluid ounces. And put on about a week before flowering. And it holds, it holds with the best fungicide product, that Endura. And this was 2 applications of Endura. Not that that really matters. I think the R1 was really the thing that was giving us the best protection this particular season. That R3 was touching R4, so that was a bit too late, really. But that's why I put this slide in here. So Cobra is another option. You do have to be a little bit careful, though, because if you're not going to get white mold, so if we're just spraying this out, there's the potential for some yield ding. I'm getting a nod from the weed scientist. That's great. I've said that before and haven't had that response. But when we look at data from a lot of different states, we can sometimes find that Cobra can ding yields, and I think it's very much variety dependent and probably temperature and how much burn did you actually get, and growth stage. That's very important. But it's a very, very interesting product, and again, I've got multiple years of this. That Cobra hangs right in there with those best fungicide products. So if you're really struggling with white mold, you might want to just consider playing around with that as well as another potential option. So that was put on about a week before flowering. All right, so, and we look at other products as well. So we look at biologicals, we look at whatever's, getting a lot of buzz, but there might not be much behind it. And believe me, we want some of these other products to work because we'd like to be able to recommend. We're worried about fungicide resistance, right? We don't want to lose these tools. So if there's other options, that'd be great. So one of the products, Oxidate, so essentially hydrogen peroxide. This has got peroxyacetic acid in it as well. We've tried that product, and here's the data from that trial. So untreated check at the bottom, yield in blue, disease in red there. So even putting Oxidate on 3 times, so at R1, R2, R3, it was no different to our untreated check. Right, and similarly, again, Endura alone was the best treatment here. We tried spiking in Oxidate with that Endura, and it was no better than Endura alone. So unfortunately, in this case, you're better off maybe saving your money and not trying that product. It's not that it can't work for disease management, but we just have not been able to get it to work for white mold management in soybean. Okay. And so I'm going to reference the Crop Protection Network a few times. So this is really a very nice place where we dump a lot of our extension material. So I was talking about fungicide efficacy a lot. We have these soybean, wheat, and corn fungicide efficacy tables. So we'll have the diseases listed up there, and then we'll rank those products, be it poor, excellent, good, fair. So we've got a ranking system just to help you, if you're dealing with white mold, go and have a look at that chart to figure out which products will or won't work for white mold management. And I'm just listing up there some of the products we tend to see, as those better products for white mold management. Any questions there about fungicides for white mold? Comments? 1 pass, 2 pass. So I think that's where Sporecaster can come in to help make a prediction. If you and I had to make a decision now, you're going to go for 1 pass. Obviously 2 pass may tend to be better, right? But it's obviously more expensive. If we had to make a call right now about when we should go, I would probably recommend that R2 growth stage, so full flower. But if we've got some flexibility, we can watch the weather. I would be using Sporecaster and trying to time that application. So what we've seen in our work is that sometimes that R1, beginning of flowering, is optimal. Sometimes waiting until R3 is optimal if we're talking about a single application. If we're going to do 2 applications, I typically come, if we're planning on 2 applications, I'd start at R1 and then come back somewhere between 7 and 14 days later. And again, I might tweak that a bit based on sporecaster and weather conditions. Seth.
Front row question.
All right, this will be good.
Do you, kind of the art of this management, do you integrate canopy development at all in the recommendations?
Yeah, so do we integrate canopy development into recommendations? Yes, we do. So Sporecaster, there's actually a couple of variations. So there's a 15-inch model and a 30-inch model. And one of the questions in the 30-inch model is, do we have sufficient canopy closure to trigger the model? So we've seen, and I could go on and on, right? We could talk an hour about white mold easily in itself. So we've seen that, yes, 15-inch rows, canopy development, we tend to find those white mold mushrooms earlier and more of them compared to 30-inch rows. So it's a big player in that. I think some of the risk prediction stuff that we can do in the future will definitely incorporate canopy closure. And I've got a graduate student working on that at the moment to see if we can help improve this sporecaster system. And canopy closure is going to be key. So those white mold mushrooms, they need a certain amount of shading and a certain amount of light coming through the canopy. Full sun, they're not going to develop, and full shade, like 100% shade, they're not going to develop. They need this sort of filtered light through the soybean canopy for the right signals to produce properly and release spores. Yeah?
With the trial, what populations of soybeans planted?
Yep.
And then also, have you looked at lower populations?
Yes.
80 to 100,000?
Yes. So here we do push things a little bit, right? Because I'm really trying to evaluate fungicides under worst case situation. But we've done these integrated trials too where we drop populations. And without a doubt, population can play into it. So dropping population down, I should include those slides, but definitely, down to 80, 100, yes, can certainly reduce white mold development. Again, it's all about that canopy closure, right? Because the mushrooms need that for development. Integrating them, yes, that's a good thing to do. If you're struggling with white mold, I definitely encourage you to drop your population. We planted these 160, dropped 160 seeds, so we're pretty high. And yeah, we've got on-farm work showing that 80 looks great. I'm a bit reluctant to drop 80. I'll let the agronomist deal with this, but I'm a bit reluctant to maybe promote dropping 80,000 seed and hoping you get a good stand if other issues pop up. Right, but yeah, I would definitely think about trying to pull back on population if you're struggling with white mold. Thank you. Did I address all those points that you brought up? Did I get all your questions, all the parts there, more or less? Cover crops, yeah. There's some really interesting stuff that's been done there. I know some of my colleagues are working on rye and planting into that. Essentially what a cover crop can do is maybe force some of those mushrooms to develop it a bit earlier because there's a canopy there, and then not infect the plant because they've released the spores too early. We had some pretty heavy white mold develop on our plant pathology farm where I'm trying to do other things. I'm trying to get frog eye leaf spot, seedling diseases. I don't want white mold on that particular farm. So what we did is no-tilled wheat into that soybean stubble. And so the intent there is to, in that wheat canopy, get those white mold mushrooms to develop, and then they've got nothing to infect. So I think if you're trying to, thinking about rotations and whatnot, that'd be the better thing to do. If you've got a bad field, and no-till it, because you want to leave the sclerotia on the soil surface, where they're more likely to germinate. You bury them more than 2 inches, they're just going to hang out and survive for many, many years, right? If you leave them on the soil surface, that tends to reduce survival. And generally, no-till folk tend to have less issues with white mold. The sclerotia just don't survive as well. Tillage is helpful for white mold survival. Yeah.
Acapella is a new epoxy.
Yes. So Acapella, are you coming from Canada? No? So I'm pretty sure Acapella is approach. Picoxystrobin? Yeah, so the label in Canada, it's called Acapella. In the US here, it's called Approach. Yeah. So what we see there, just really short, we tend to see 2 passes of approach being equivalent to 1 pass of Endura. For some reason, it just doesn't have quite the punch or staying power of Endura. Don't know why that is, but that's what we've tended to see. Yeah. Okay, so I did want to mention, still on white mold here. So we talked about, cultural practices a little bit, fungicides. I'm going to really emphasize varieties now. So we've been doing variety screenings for companies to help them make recommendations within the state. So this is one company screening their varieties for white mold resistance. So we go through and we do some really intensive rating of white mold. So this is the percentage disease severity index. So it's incorporating the number of plants that are infected and how badly infected they are. So 100% is 100% of plants infected and 100% like completely dead, just done, right? 0 be healthy. So we always see a spread of responses when we plant out varieties from a single company. And there's a really tight correlation, of course, between the amount of disease and yield, okay? So again, if you're dealing with white mold, incorporating variety resistance is kind of a big deal. It's pretty damn important. So we're seeing about a 20 bushel difference from the best performing to the worst performing, right? So the least amount of disease here, highest yield compared to the most susceptible and lower yield. So we had about 25 bushel difference in 21, about 16 bushel difference in 22. So yeah, variety selection is very, very important. And that's just my summary points. So, variety, number 1, thinking about problematic fields, tracking them. Of course, the weather's going to play into this, whether we have conditions that are met for disease development. Plant population is really important. Fungicides at the right time. It's got to be on during flowering from R1 through to R3. And there's biologicals too. We know Contans does a reasonable job at lowering the sclerotia population in the soil. But just like fungicides, they're not silver bullets, right? You put this treatment out, it does not mean you're going to eliminate disease. We've really got to use an integrated approach too. So incorporating variety resistance with a fungicide in those bad white mold years. Oh yeah, got some kind of cool slides too. So anyone got questions about drones? Nah, nobody? You guys are quiet.
I have so many questions about drones.
Yeah. So, yeah, okay. Well, so my colleague, Damon Smith from Wisconsin. So this would be Damon Smith, so my fellow pathologist, Wisconsin. I think this is Brian Luck. Yeah, you're getting some confirmation. Thank you. So the drone sort of guy. And then this character here, Sean Connolly, the agronomist. So they did some drone work, basically to have a look at, could we use drones to control white mold? Just a pretty video here, ground rig compared to drone. So I think the one thing I would tell you, if you're asking me, the big thing is canopy coverage, and the technology is changing so much, right? So this is one particular setup and one particular height. So if someone can come in for half the price, but they're going to fly, twice as high, now you've got, a quarter of the coverage. You're going to spread stuff further, but coverage is going to be really, really important here. And I think that's one of the pieces of the puzzle that is just going to be critical. So here's some overhead shots. So you can see some white mold in their check strips and those greenness scores. Let's just jump straight through to what they had. So this is the amount of disease. So no fungicide, really, really heavy levels of disease there, 80 on that score, up to 100. Both the ground rig and the drone were comparable, no statistical difference there. So that was pretty cool, pretty neat to see. And in terms of yield, a similar sort of deal. Ground rig, not statistically different to the drone. Maybe if we run more trials, coverage will become an issue and we can get a difference. But again, what drone are you flying? How high are you flying? Is it windy? You've really got to pay attention to coverage. And I know we've had quite a few people use drones to spray their corn for tar spot and other things, and that's cool, great. I think the weaknesses are going to show when we get a heavy tar spot epidemic, and all of a sudden we can see where we just didn't get the best coverage from that drone, right? So that would be the weakness. Very, very exciting technology though. So yeah, thanks to Damon and the crew for sharing those slides.
You use less water in the drone.
Yeah. So we're down to gallon, gallon and a half to 2 gallons or so per acre in the drone. So that can be an issue, absolutely. Canopy penetration too, so I guess we didn't talk about fungicide application. We have to get that product down onto the flowers. It's not going to like hit the top of the plant and then move down. It doesn't work like that with most fungicides. So again, I'm really impressed actually to see that data. I almost don't believe it, but it's pretty cool that in that instance they're able to manage. Other questions or comments about that? Yeah.
So then if they're only down to, say, a gallon of water, are they using up blue water or something like that? They're certainly not using tap because it's just that much.
Oh, right.
Important, isn't it?
What do you mean by blue water?
Oh, they're recycling, making sure the pH is just...
Oh, yeah, okay. I mean, I definitely would be, absolutely. I'd be making sure that water is, yeah, absolutely. There's not going to be any issue from that. You want the best efficacy. You don't have to truck as much around, I guess, right? Because you're putting on less. But yeah, I think that'd be a big issue. But to me, the bigger thing is, yeah, also just that coverage and how high are we flying, the wind speeds, all those sorts of pieces. Any idea what this particular disease is? Come on, somebody. It loves it when it rains pretty heavy in August and plant early in the cool, wet soils. SDS, yeah, I'm hearing those SDS whispers. Thank you. So I think this was 22. So it's actually a fairly dry year for the most part. So the lesson here is don't plant a susceptible variety or you might get smoked, right? So there was a few fields that had very, very bad SDS. We track it down. It turns out it's a germplasm issue. That variety was susceptible. So don't do that, right? Or if you're chasing this brand new high yielding soybean, cool, that's totally fine. But pay attention to disease scores and know your disease issues that you're likely to face in your fields, okay? All right, so I think I'm nearly out of time. So it's been spreading around. Let me talk you through a really quick story that I think is really cool. And you had SDS 5 years ago, but you haven't had it since. Cool, good for you. But does that mean it's gone away? Absolutely not. So these are 4 different soybean varieties, a couple of Asgrow, a couple of Pioneer, and we had 2 varieties from each company that were really resistant. We saw no SDS symptoms. The other 2 varieties were very susceptible to SDS, and we always see symptoms develop. What we did is actually took the roots of those plants, so the susceptible and the resistant, ground them up, used a DNA technique to ask how much of that SDS fungus is in the roots. So over time, V3 through to R8, we're able to track, and yeah, like it's increasing, right? So one part of the story here is that the amount of Fusarium virguliforme, the SDS pathogen, is increasing in the roots over time. But the thing that really struck me is that there was no difference between the susceptible and resistant varieties. So what I'm saying to you is that just because you're planting a resistant variety and you see no foliar symptoms of the SDS, there may still be root infection, and it's very good at hanging out. It can also colonize corn to some extent and just hang out in the field. So corn-soy rotations really don't do anything to this pathogen. It's just going to wait until you make that mistake I just showed you of planting a susceptible variety and we get some rain. And then you're done. It's going to take your yield away. All right, so really quick too, we're working on some risk prediction tools. So that tool I just showed you to look at the amount of that fungus in the roots. What we're doing now is taking soil samples. We've already proven that if you give us a field, we can tell you where the hot spots of SDS are going to develop in that field based on the soil amount. Now we're just scaling up and working with colleagues across the country to essentially see if we can apply it to different soil types and different geographies. Let's touch on seed treatments really quick. There's really 2 products that we see consistent yield protection and disease suppression from, and that would be Alevo and Saltro, and compared to a base treatment in this instance. They're really the two. So, and we've looked at fungicide sensitivity there. I won't go on about that. But again, variety selection, seed treatment, and extended rotation. So Iowa State did some work looking at 3-4 year rotations, but not just corn and soy, but incorporating different crops. And that reduced the amount of SDS in the soil. And then your quick warning about red crown rot of soybeans. So a fairly new disease characterized by these red fungal structures on those lower stems. It reminds me a lot of soybean sudden death syndrome in terms of being soil-borne and producing SDS-like symptoms, but it's a new disease for us. What we know at the moment is that there was this red crown rot pathogen was found back in the 60s and 70s on peanut and soybean in the south, but what we're seeing up in Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky is a different variant. There seems to be some genetic differences, which may explain why all of a sudden we're seeing it move to further north. Some of you have probably heard about some of the outbreaks in Pike County. So here's some fields with a lot of dead soybean plants, that yellowing of the foliage there, and then some of the symptoms just on those root systems. So if you're not sure, please send it into a diagnostic clinic to figure out what is going on. You need to know what the problem is. At the moment, we really don't know a great deal about control management options. There's really very, very little work being done in terms of seed treatments and variety screening. So it's a new disease, something we're trying to get our hands around as quickly as we can. So I can leave it there. Where are we at with time? We've got 5 minutes. So I guess, are there questions or comments about anything I've spoken about today? Yep.
So on the red crown rot, I farm in Illinois, or northern Illinois, and I work for a co-op that goes all the way up into Wisconsin, or Wisconsin Cooperative.
Yep.
And we started playing around a little bit with a lab in Iowa called Trace Genomics, where they run DNA tests on the soil.
Yes.
We don't think we saw red crown rot anywhere, but almost every sample I took out of 60 samples all the way up through north of Madison had red crown rot genetic material identified in the sample. So what's...
Yeah, so the question was about some of these new companies, Trace Genomics and Pattern Ag are a couple of the big ones, right? So essentially what they're doing is getting your soil, doing DNA sequencing on that, and then comparing the sequences to pathogen genomes. In a nutshell is basically what they're doing. So it's really exciting, but it's very early days. And so you're basically saying that they're finding this red crown rot pathogen up north in areas where it hasn't been reported yet. So that may very well be a false positive, right? I think it is. This disease may very well be in Michigan already. It may very well be in Wisconsin already. But I have seen some of the reports, and it's, again, I'm very excited about the possibilities, but we can very easily have false reports. And it comes back to how the analysis are being done. And I know the companies are scrambling as hard as they can to give you the best report. They want to provide a valuable surface that you'll come back and use, but it's pretty early days. So I'd just be cautious with those types of reports. Yeah, that's totally cool. Absolutely. And I know they used our one of our DNA techniques, or anyway, one of the companies did for the SDS pathogen. But that type of assay we use is only for that pathogen. It doesn't pick up everything else. So what they're doing now is just sequencing everything and then trying to sort through all this DNA. And so the big trouble then comes, they need to essentially screen all of that DNA against known pathogens and unique DNA features that only occur in that pathogen. And that may be where some of that false positives are coming from. Yeah. And it's early days on the red crown rot issue too. There's a whole lot we don't know about it, right? So we don't have some of the genomic resources, and that's why I'd be, I'd question those, I guess, and just, yeah.
You said it was identified in Pike County, Illinois?
Yep.
And why did they think that was kind of the first notice of it in Illinois? Well, maybe it's been here, but I mean...
Yeah, why? Well, yeah, so why there? I don't know, but I can tell you it's soil-borne. So you want to be very, very careful about moving equipment, purchasing equipment and moving it, especially long-distance movement of equipment around with soil on it. That's a surefire way to bring in weed seeds or nematodes or some new pathogen you haven't had before. I don't know exactly why Pike County. This last year, there were some really alarming photos from just the west side of Indianapolis too. So probably equivalent northern sort of latitude to Pike County, I guess, or thereabouts. But anyway, just the field was just pocketed with big holes in the soybean canopy from this red crown rot. So Pike County's not alone. And I think the other thing that we see, like similar with soybean sudden death syndrome, it might be present in the field, but it's hard to see until the population sort of builds in the soil. And then all of a sudden, you know, we've got these pockets where like, wow, there's dead plants here that clearly, you know. Yeah.
I didn't know if the drought was kind of isolated in that area.
Yeah, it's a good question. There certainly may be environmental elements to all of this as well. Absolutely, without a doubt. But I think one of the key things I think we're going to find out is that we've got this new disease, and it's spreading around the country, and it's just going to pop up, you know, where it's been sort of spread to. And then yes, the environment from year to year is going to dictate how bad that is. Yeah, without a doubt. And again, I have no doubt, like heavy rainfall events are going to push this thing along. Anything else? All right. Well, I'll be around through coffee. If you want to grab me, feel free to do that. We can get you some of these slides too if anyone wants those. The ones I can share. So, yeah. All right. Thank you. Yep. Oops, sorry, I shut it off on you.
Thank you so much. So I've just been getting some hints, texts. In case you are having problems seeing, we apologize. These, again, and I know you just mentioned this, we are trying to work with the presenters to share their slides and what they're okay with us sharing. So perhaps we'll have PDF slides of some of this information on lsoyadvisor.com. We are also recording the sessions as well. But again, just check back with me or the presenter if you have any questions. We're going to take a 15-minute coffee break. So feel free to get up, move around, network, ask your questions, and we'll be back here at 10:30. All right. All right, we're going to welcome our last presenter of this event. So we'll ask if you can start making your way back to your seats.
So what's the time frame on this?
This is until 11:30.
10:30 to 11:30?
Or you can go a little longer.
No, I don't want to go. Not before lunch.
All right. Our last presenter today is Dr. Seth Naeve. He is a soybean agronomist with the University of Minnesota and an associate professor in the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics. He also leads the Soybean Production and Physiology Project, which focuses on surveys and research. Dr. Naeve addresses soybean quality, dynamic geographic variation, quality measurement, and agronomic practices to increase soybean quality. Let's welcome Dr. Naeve.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. Okay, perfect, yeah. I can't hold my coffee, I guess, too. This the green light is kind of intriguing here, so it does keep me focused. I guess it was bothering people if I faced it this way, but we're going to stay on focus this way. Yeah, again, I'm Seth Naeve, and I do have an interesting position in Minnesota. I've kind of carved out a little niche working on soybean composition and quality. But today we're going to talk all on the production side. I know you're familiar with many of my colleagues, and so I don't get around in this neighborhood very often, so I really appreciate the invitation to come here today. In fact, Stephanie asked me to come here many months ago, and I don't remember the conversation of how we fell into this topic, whether it was me or her. But anyway, I had to put this together in the last few days. And I really ended up with something that was really highly physiological and a bunch of crop physiology theory and a bunch of other stuff. And I ended up pulling most of that out. But that is going to be underlying a lot of the presentation today. And so I feel a little bit humbled by the fact that Illinois has had a lot of really good crop physiologists over the years. I really admire your current soybean agronomist, Giovanni, for both Emerson and Fred in what they've done for the science over the years. And so I don't know if I can add anything beyond their experience and knowledge, but I'm going to give you something that's more of my own thinking that's come around for a few years. I feel like I've been around 25 years now in Minnesota. I feel like I understand the crop pretty well for Minnesota. So I'm trying to give you a presentation that's trying to give you an idea of the sense of the soybean crop and the physiology of the crop in a non-geographical context. So I basically pulled out all the Minnesota data. So we're mostly going to talk about stress today, but I think it's important to talk about how yield is formed as well. It's important to know how the soybean plant functions and where those yields come from. So we're going to talk, it's really interactive. We can't talk about stress without talking about yield formation and how we get good yields. And so I'm going to start this thing with kind of the end, really. So we're going to talk about my own feelings about yield establishment by the farmer. So what can farmers do to increase soybean yields? We're going to talk a little bit about the soybean physiology behind this, but again, I pulled out most of the really heavy theory. And then talk a little bit about water stress. I'm using water stress as a good example for how stress affects soybean, or how stress might affect soybeans, and the evolution of crop plants over time and how they deal with stress. I think it's a nice story. Stephanie asked me to talk about smoke effects, so we're going to talk about it. It's a hot topic, so I'm going to crush it. Okay? Hopefully we won't have to talk, you won't have to talk about it again after today. And then just a little bit towards the end, I'm going to talk about some very recent research we're doing in my lab around the critical period in soybean. Again, this has a physiological bent to it, but I think it's an important one, and it's timely. So, like with the other speakers, I hope that you'll entertain me with some questions as we go. We don't have to get through all this. I'm happy to skip through a bunch of this if we don't, if we get sidelined on anything. So please ask as we go along. I think it'll be more entertaining for you all as well. Okay, so here is my short list for how to establish maximum yield potential by soybeans. So I've been thinking a lot about this winter, about what farmers do to maximize soybean yields. And you'll see this list. I'm talking about variety selection, good soil fertility, narrow rows, early planting, a sufficient population, and soil management. This is what we need to do to position that crop to maximize yields. Now, this might look a little familiar. I don't know how many are there. There are six. So it might rhyme a little bit with these 6 secrets from Fred Below. And that either is because we're both really brilliant guys, or I plagiarized it from him, or maybe this isn't rocket science. Maybe these things aren't that complicated. We're really talking about how to position the crop for maximum yield and how to increase yields. This is a completely separate thing, and I'm going to try to lead you through this a little bit. Farmers really need to do 2 things. They need to position their crop to maximize yields, and then they need to preserve that yield. I hope by the time we get to the end of this, that this notion that we can somehow add yield on top of a soybean crop through some magic potion you purchase at the co-op, we can avoid that discussion. So just a little bit of an aside, I'm going to go way back and talk about a study. I'm not going to go through all the data, but I do want to talk about a study that's 10 years old now. But this was a really nice project that USB funded. This is what we called the kitchen sink trial. And I don't know how much Emerson got around and talked about the kitchen sink work that he did in cooperation with this larger group. But over a 6-year period, we had either 6 or 9 states involved with this project, basically looking at how to increase yields through management. And these were purely agronomic things to do. These were basically off-the-shelf products and management that we could do as agronomists to try to increase yields. And in doing so, and this is some of the work even that came before what Fred did with these kind of studies that he did over time, we had combinations of all of these things on together in order to try to see how much these additional products could, I lost the word, basically go together to plug themselves in to help increase yields. So just really quick, these are the list of studies, and I laughed with Meaghan a little bit because I said, you know, now there's 2 non-weed scientists that are going to talk about cobra this morning, so I think that's kind of entertaining. But cobra is an interesting one because this is one of those products that has kind of held on there among some farmers, and I brought it in today because I think it's an interesting aspect about stress in soybeans. There's a lot of farmers that have this notion that soybean needs to be stressed a little bit. And cobra is one of the ways that they've thought that they could actually poke the crop a little bit and force it into respond to that stress and end up yielding more in the end. I don't believe in it, but I think it has real biological implications for the crop, and we heard about it with white mold. It's a good example of where it can do some benefit by changing that canopy, tightening that canopy, and opening that canopy. And there's probably some physiology within the individual soybeans that make it a little bit more resistant to some stresses as well, other stresses as well. But just really quickly to go through what we did, we looked at seed treatments, we looked at none or a fungicide alone, fungicide plus biologicals at the time. And then we had, again at the time, we had some different things that were being sold. At the time, it was these LCOs that were in, the idea was to help poke that soybean plant and make it trigger some resistance mechanisms so it'd be more resistant to stresses later. We had 150 pounds of nitrogen onto the crop. We wanted to make sure that we had enough N because there was a lot of, there was reoccurring discussions about adding nitrogen to soybean. A good yielding soybean needs a little bit of extra N. It can't fix enough N. We got to add some N. So we added 150 pounds of N. By the way, this blows up your economics. If you're ever running an economic analysis on something and you try to put 150 pounds of N on, that sure screws that up. So Cobra was a defoliant. We put a foliar fertilizer on. Bioforge is a Stoller product, and they claimed it to be an antioxidant. I don't even know if Bioforge is still sold. I think there's new iterations probably. We used Headline and Warrior that were replaced with Preaxor and Indigo later as foliar fungicides and insecticides. So here's a summary of the results, and I'm not going to go into the detail of it. If you want to talk later, I threw some data slides at the very end. We could come back to these if you're really interested. But I think the highlight is this. We had 60 site years total in this study. In the central region, 28% of the locations had something that yielded more than the control. So only a quarter of the sites had any of those treatments or actually the kitchen sink type treatment that yielded more than the control. So 3/4 of the site didn't do anything for us with all that extra management on top. We got a better response in the north, and honestly it was because we had a lot of aphids around. That prophylactic application of insecticide actually got us something. Even when we didn't have a lot of aphids around, we still got a little bit of a nick, a bump in yields, and that really drove, that one prophylactic insecticide really helped push it in the north, and it really was tied to years when we had aphids. So my conclusions, seed treatments and the early season products really showed relatively little value for us. And again, most of that was in the north. We saw less through the central region that included Illinois. Benefits from the insecticide were really the drivers, again, in the north. And really interestingly for us, and I think this is another big overall example of what we learned from this work, is that there was an interaction with yield level. So the highest yielding locations didn't get any extra benefit from all these additional products. And likewise, the lowest yielding sites weren't saved by any of these additional products or programs that we put on these things. So really, these things were acting individually to protect the yield in the most cases. So what my take home from this is really that only the products that had true pesticidal mode of actions really did anything for us. Again, only those products that we have known pesticidal mode of actions work. So either seed treatment fungicide insecticides or foliar fungicide insecticides. Otherwise, nothing worked for us. Now, I know we did kind of a small sampling, and everybody from industry is going to say, well, you didn't test this one, or you didn't test that one, or you didn't test the other thing. But this is what we found overall in this trial. And when I look at subsequent work that we've done, either individually or collectively, it basically comes back to this kind of thinking on my part. So we also found relatively little, let me come back to this. Did I have it? Yeah, let me come back to this. So what we're really doing out here is we're maintaining these existing yields. These things that we added, there was nothing that we added to promote additional yield from that crop. So in terms of these, the pesticides, we found really relatively little use, little value for prophylactic use. So I'm trying to qualify this just a little bit. So those pesticides did work for us overall in general because they worked a little better than everything else. But we really found little evidence that suggested that we should be putting these things out everywhere. And my feeling is really that these calendar sprays are no replacement for in-field scouting and application. So even when we did get hits from putting these things on prophylactically, I know that had we timed those sprays more appropriately based on pest pressure, we would have gotten even more value from them. Okay. This is another one. I'm not going to go into any detail. I'm going to give you a very high-level summary over this because this is Giovanni's working on this project with us, and I'd really like him to talk with you about it at some point, and you could hear from him directly. But we've got a multi-state project going on through our Science for Success team. So this is a group of now about 20 universities, 22 universities, that we have soybean agronomists that get together a couple times a year. We come up with protocols. We design trials for really important research topics that need to be evaluated over broad geographies. And so this is a good example of one where we're testing biological products at a lot of locations. So in 22, we had a test of 9 different biological products versus a check at 50 sites. So we were able to evaluate the exact same products at 50 sites in 2022. 2023, I think it's closer to 70 or 75 sites that we evaluated those products in. So I'll give you the take home. The take home from the work is that we tested biological seed treatments. The biological seed treatments are not an answer for everybody. And in fact, I don't really know that we found really good evidence that they're an answer for anybody. I really went into the trial thinking that we were going to find a couple products that found some real value for certain environments, and they just didn't poke up like that for us. And so we gave these things as good of a test as anybody could or should, and we still didn't find a lot of value in them. So I think this supports my overall message that a lot of these add-on products that are being sold to farmers as yield-promoting products without any kind of real claim for the mode of actions for them, except that they somehow protect the plant in some magical way, don't really work for us very well. So again, the farmer's job is really to set that crop up and then protect that crop at all costs, or not at all costs, but at some cost to them through IPM principles. And again, these yield-enhancing products, we just don't find a lot of benefit to it. And I know a lot of you think that these universities are just a bunch of conservative old curmudgeons that want to poo-poo every new product that comes out. But we really want to find things that work for farmers. We really want to identify the things that are going to help increase yields. And it's so far that we've had a challenge. And I think part of the other problem with this is that we're being swamped, you're being swamped by numbers. At Commodity Classic last year, I think there was 40 booths of different companies selling biological products. It's the perfect revenue generating source for big companies. It's an ideal set of products that can be generated. There's a low entry measure to be able to get into the market, low risk, and there's a chance for making some real dollars from these things. And so there's a lot of companies that are involved with it. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about crop growth. I know this is probably a little bit too heady for us this late in the morning before lunch, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we get to yield, what makes yield in soybean. And a bunch of the slides I'm skipping basically indicate that what we want in soybean crop is we want that crop to develop as quickly as we can through that early season all the way up to the beginning of seed filling. So all the research has indicated that basically the slope of the crop growth, and if you think about it in the fields, is basically how fast that crop canopies, and then how lush of a canopy does that crop develop, and how quickly it develops that canopy. That speed of development is basically the indicator of what kind of yield you're going to get at the very end. There aren't other indicators that do a good job of indicating what yield you're going to have. It isn't canopy closure date. It isn't total canopy biomass. It's actually the rate of accumulation of biomass over time. So probably some of this is an academic point because that integrates a lot of that growing season that's important for us. But it also tells us that we need to have good growing conditions over a long period of time. And I include this because we've got some other topics coming up in just a minute that are important. So the three things that we multiply together are the incident radiation. We have to have light. You know, these are crop plants. They're dependent on receiving light from the atmosphere. So if we look at the crop growth rate, and again, my assumption here is that crop growth is the best indicator of yields in the end. Crop growth rate over the year is going to vary with the incident radiation. On any particular day, whether we have higher or lower radiation is going to have an impact on the crop growth rate. So radiation here is in the black. Crop growth rate here goes up, and actually crop growth rate is in the black. The yellow is the incident radiation. You can see they follow each other over time. But the crop can't absorb light if it isn't green out there. So any of that crop space that has, or that area of where you're producing your crop, where you don't have green soybeans, where that light is striking the soil, that is essentially lost energy to us. We're not gaining anything in the system. The soybean has to capture that light. So intercepted radiation, so we have to have radiation and then we have to intercept it. So you have to have the light and then we have to have green leaves out there to capture the light. And that intercepted radiation has a nice correlation, very high correlation with that crop growth rate. So again, more light, more intercepted light gives us a better crop growth rate. And then there's this thing that we call radiation use efficiency. Unfortunately, this is kind of a catch-all for everything. It basically says how efficient is the crop in turning the light that it's captured into biomass that is growing, that is producing in that crop. So it's basically a conversion of the efficiency of turning light into growth and then eventually into yield. And so there's a lot of variation in this thing. The breeders have all tried to give us soybean varieties that have a better radiation use efficiency, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into it. It's leaf angle, leaf size, leaf shape, canopy depth, photosynthetic capacity, efficiencies of the photosynthesis, water use, etc. I'll go into this thing. So it captures a whole bunch of stuff. It basically, though, is a conversion from light captured into biomass produced. So how do these stresses that we're talking about affect the crop growth? It affects all of these things along the way. So all those three pieces that I mentioned earlier are affected by stresses. And I'm going to use drought stress as an example. And this is the #1 most important stress for soybeans in the Midwest. Mostly we're looking at dry land production. I see a lot of legs, even through the fog this morning. I could see a lot of irrigation legs in the area. But it's still, overall, it's our #1 limiting factor to soybean production in the upper Midwest. And I wanted to use drought stress as an indicator because it's incredibly deceptive, but it's also gives us a really interesting picture about how soybeans and other crop plants have evolved to deal with stresses. Okay. This is a figure from a 1970 text, so it's even older than I am, believe it or not. And they're looking at soybeans, sunflower, and corn. This is kind of a complicated text, or a figure, so we've tried to kind of simplify it. My colleague, Aníbal Cerruto's Argentine guy, works with me, so this happens to be still in Spanish, but we have corn, sunflower, and soybeans. The differences don't really matter to us. I want to show you the biggest parts here. What we're talking about is leaf water potential. Water potential is basically how dry, it's a measure of water status of the soybean leaf. So as soon as we start to get some drought symptoms, that would be right here, right at this point here, we have fully watered soybeans or corn or sunflowers. As we move this direction, this is more and more drought stress. So this is perfectly well watered. This would be 100% water capacity of the soil, no problems at all. As things start to get dry, what happens? We have leaf expansion starts to drop right away. So as soon as there's any even sense that that soybean leaf is getting just a little bit dry, the first thing that happens is the leaf expansion stops, or the leaf stops expanding. So we don't have any further canopy development as soon as we get the slightest bit of drought stress. Okay, this other figure shows photosynthetic level, and these are just based on relative amounts. So this is 100% here to 0, and 100% for photosynthesis. You can see the photosynthesis keeps on cranking out for quite a while. The plant is still continuing to turn light energy into sugars that it can use to grow that soybean plant. You'll notice that we put a line through here from where the soybean plant just starts to reduce photosynthetic capacity. But at that point, the leaf expansion is completely stopped. Okay? So think about this period. The soybean plant is starting to get dry. It quits expanding, but photosynthesis is cranking out. So it keeps cranking along. So what's the plant doing? If it's not expanding its leaf, but it's still cranking out photosynthate, cranking out sugars, what's that soybean plant doing with that energy? Roots. It's going to the root, exactly. So that plant is just sending all of that energy down to the root. So this is a perfect response to a stress in many ways. So one is, in response to that stress, it basically is taking all the reserves that plant is using to make leaves, and it's just sending those down to the root. Why is it sending it down to the root? Well, it's probably growing more roots so it can explore more soil and it can find more water in the soil. The other side of that is really important though too, is you look at what that canopy looks like. That soybean plant is actually thinking that this little bit of dryness that it's smelling out there might portend something for the future. So it says, hey, instead of continuing to crank out new leaves, maybe we should hang out and be a little bit small here. Maybe we need to reserve a little bit of water or conserve a little bit of water. So what the soybean plant does under some light drought stress does something just like this. It basically maintains itself, reduces leaf expansion, doesn't put on any new leaves, continues to crank out photosynthate to send down to the root to pull water up. Meanwhile, the well-watered plants would look something like this. And you could imagine that if the drought would continue, that this crop here might look a lot better than this one because it's actually ripped through a lot less water. So I use this drought stress as an example of how stresses, common stresses like drought, affect a plant, but how evolution has actually shaped these plants, and some breeding probably has affected this as well, to make them better adapted for those conditions. So stress doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It can position a crop for doing better in the future, but like with drought, these stresses, we have to know what's coming in the future. So going back to the cobra example, we could do something a little like this with cobra. We could spray those things. We could keep those plants a little bit tighter and more upright. if we knew we were going to have drought conditions later, if we knew they were going to be stressed later, then that might be a benefit for us. And I think that's probably why we've had some studies that have shown some benefit to cobra in very limited situations. It's because we've also had some situations where we've had the weather events have actually fit right into that aspect. Okay. Drought stress, or sorry, not drought stress, light stress from smoke. So this is something that I've thought about quite a bit just because I get these same questions, and over time I've always answered with the same type of response based on the physiology that I understand about corn and soybean. Mark Jiske at Corteva was getting these same types of questions over the years. And he put together a really nice report. And I know you probably can't see it, but if you Google Pioneer or Corteva and smoke and corn yields, you'll get a nice report on this. So I would just go ahead and do that. There's a PDF and there's also a website. I think it has all the exact same information. What I've done is I basically lifted his report out. And I'm going to go through some of the slides from his report because I think he does a nice job of laying this out. I heard him give a talk on this just a month ago, and he laid this out very well. And so rather than me putting it in my own words, I'm just going to utilize his text. This is, I mean, just in terms of background on this, it's important to know over time, we've really increased the amount of forest wildfires that we've had in the U.S. In the past, 40 years or so, we've gone basically fourfold the amount of area burned on an annual basis due to wildfires. So this is a bigger problem over time. If we look at the really long range, so we're going back to 1895 here, you can see this figure just shows departure from normal of any particular year, and I think this is California. Yeah, these are California temperatures. So this is deviation from temperature, so 5 degrees warmer to 4 degrees colder. And this is deviation in rainfall, 6 inches above to 6 inches below. So this is hot and dry, and this is cold and wet. They've also highlighted in this figure the more recent years of 2000 and 2020 are the dark dots. And you can see those all are shown in warmer years. So the past 20 years have all been above average temperatures. And if you look at when the worst wildfires were, they occur in this quadrant. So we had both hot years, but also dry years, as you'd expect. But the issue is that we keep clumping down here in this corner, and things seem to be going south and east. Just a figure to highlight the smoke image. So these are satellite images, and this is one day, July 21st of 21. And you can see that we were getting smoke from both eastern and western wildfires converging in the Midwest somewhere or another. And I think that's why we ended up getting so much smoke over such a long period of time, even over multiple years, as we were getting both western and eastern fires. Okay, so there's two pieces to the smoke part. Reduced intensity. So the first thing that everybody notices when they go outside, there's a reduction in light levels. Okay, so this reflects a portion of that sunlight, puts it back into the atmosphere, so we've lost some of that. An important thing to consider here, though, is that corn is slightly more sensitive to reduced light. And physiologically, here's some important things to think about with light intensity in individual leaves. An individual leaf can only absorb between 10 and 40% of the light that's incident from the sky. So if we had a full sun day and we took a soybean leaf and hung it out here, that capacity, that leaf only has a capacity to use about 25–30% of that light incident on it. The rest either gets reflected or it gets transmitted back through that leaf. So that leaf is not, it cannot utilize all that light itself. And corn can actually utilize just a little bit more of that than soybean. So corn has a little bit higher capacity as a C4 plant than a C3 plant. So we're going to talk about corn and soybean. We're mostly going to talk about corn in this piece, and I think I just want you to know that we're using corn as an example because corn is going to be slightly more sensitive to reduced light levels than soybean, but I think we can transpose the data from either one. The other thing that smoke does is it causes an increased diffusion of the light. And this is the really important piece that affects crop growth. So if you think about sunlight, it's coming from not an infinite distance, but a nearly infinite distance from us. So that sunlight is coming and the rays are essentially parallel. So if you think about you're walking out on the sidewalk or down your driveway on a bright sunny day, what does your shadow look like? You've got these nice crisp edges around your shadow. The light is striking your body. You get a shade from that. And you end up with these nice crisp edges because all of that light is basically coming parallel from the sun. So you've got a very heavily shaded area and then a very light area around that shadow. Or shadows from a building or tree, whatever. If you're out on a hazy day, what do you see? No shadow, right? And these smoky days, you get something kind of in between. You get a bit of a shadow and a bit of not. The tendency is to think that, well, it's because of reduction of that light around the outside. We're just not seeing our shadow. But the reality is what we're doing is we're seeing, I think I have a figure. Yeah, it's not a very good figure, but this represents it as well. What we're seeing is that this light is actually coming in a diffuse pattern. So as the light is striking water vapor, water droplets, particulates from smoke, it's getting broken up, and then we get basically the light is coming in from all angles. So that's why we don't have shadows, is simply because the light is coming in from all different directions. I like this figure, except for those lines should be parallel. They show two different types of particulates in the atmosphere, and they'll break up light a little bit differently. But the point is that instead of striking that object from one direction, whenever we have anything in the atmosphere, again, rain, vapor, or particulates, we get this scattering of light. So what does that do in a crop canopy? Well, what it ends up doing is it distributes that light through the canopy. The easiest way to think about it is that on a pure sunny day, all those leaves on the top of the plant are absorbing all of that light. That light that they can't absorb is getting reflected off. Those leaves down within the canopy then basically are sitting in full shade because we've got this crisp shade formed from each of those leaves. Those lower leaves are actually very, very dark. When we get a little bit of diffuse light, we actually break that up and the light penetrates the canopy better. So we've got much better canopy penetration. So the old-time agronomists have always talked about hazy days. Actually, slight haze in the atmosphere will actually be better photosynthetically because we're moving more of that light, distributing it through the canopy. This is the same thing if you've heard corn agronomists talk about upright leaves. It's the same exact principle. We've bred these crops like corn to have very vertical leaves, and the reason we've done that is to be able to share that light. Basically, the light strikes that corn leaf at an angle, and it uses a portion of that. The rest of the light then goes down into the canopy and hits lower leaves. When we get diffuse light, this is exactly the same thing. So you can see what's happening here. I'm laying this out for you. So we have a reduction in light, total light, but that light that's striking the canopy under smoky conditions is more diffuse, so there's an opportunity for us to have a better penetration into the canopy. So what does solar radiation do for us? So reductions in yield can be really significant. So agronomists love to go put out shade cloth over crop plants and see what happens. So this group did this in corn at various times. and they found 50% reduction in yield by putting out shade cloth that reduced the light by 50%. So again, this is just open weave cloth that reduced the light level within the canopy by 50%, and they were actually to reduce the yield as much as 50%, but the timing is really critical. They had to hit it when? Tasseling, right? We all know corn is very, very sensitive to stresses during tasseling. Right at VT, R1, we've got the most stress here, and this is when they saw the greatest yield reduction. But you can see they had, this is the check, and basically the yield data is equally proportional to this. You can see when they stressed the crop either earlier or later, they didn't have much of an effect. So the timing of light stress is important. Okay, so how much does wildfire smoke affect the light? So we know that timing is important. We know that if you have enough reduction in light energy, you can reduce the crop yields. So we do know also that cloud cover can reduce solar radiation by 50% as well. So heavy cloudy days can really reduce things. So even knowing this, you can know that if you have enough cloudy days during the right time of year, you can reduce yields. But we kind of chalk that up to being natural for some reason. We know that cloudy days are part of a normal growing season. They actually hurt us. You know, Randy Dowdy in Georgia, is that where he's at? Part of the reason he can grow tremendous crops is he has 100% sunshine down there. It's very clear days during the right part of crop production. We also appreciate cloudy days because they bring rain that's important for our crops in terms of yield potential. So rain is also important for us from that perspective. So I think that's why psychologically we tend to dismiss cloudy days as they actually end up helping us because they bring sun. So what's the relative effect of smoke? There's a couple studies here, 2 in California and 1 in Ohio State. Over 6 weeks, they saw a 3.6 reduction in solar radiation, but they saw a 34% increase in diffuse light. So they ended up seeing a net increase, very small, but a net increase in photosynthesis. So they reduced light levels, but they had enough of this diffuse light to actually increase photosynthesis. Another study, they found 11% reduction in solar radiation. And then the Ohio State folks, just a couple years ago, they looked back through their data just to see how much light reduction they were getting because of smoke, and it was only 6 to 7%. So even though it seems like there's a lot of reduction in light, I think it's because it's an unnatural kind of a thing to us psychologically, and that's why we kind of impose this idea that it's a more important factor than it is. Okay, there are direct effects that are the third piece to this, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this to say that there's pollution effects, there's ozone effects due to smoke, but the reality is our background levels of these things are really, really high already. Our crop yields are already reduced due to ozone damage today, but we don't talk about it because we always have those things. It's in the background. Adding smoke onto this thing just doesn't add any extra, an imperceptible or a minuscule amount of additional damage. Okay, so corn may be more sensitive to smoke, but the value of the increased diffusion of light is probably going to outweigh the reduction in light intensity that we see because of most smoke events. So the net benefit is going to be very, very small for us. We're either going to see a plus or minus, but probably the effect of the smoke is not going to reduce our yields on our corn or soybeans. And there's probably going to be a lot of interactive effects that are too complicated to talk about. And I think a lot of farmers got onto this one this year when it was dry as well, and there was a lot of chatter about smoke actually saving yields because it reduced light intensity, it kept our crops cool, reduced transpiration, maybe we saved a little bit of water because of this. Those kind of factors are going to be involved, but they're really too complicated to kind of nail down in anything like this. So that's my full summary on smoke. Questions? I know I put everybody to sleep. Any questions on smoke damage? What didn't I cover about smoke relative to what you've been thinking about? Okay, we killed it. Okay, source, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this either, but I think it is important for us to think about source-sink relationships, especially relative to the next slide I show. Soybeans, a source tissue is any kind of tissue that provides the resources for another tissue to grow. Basically, it's either sugars created through photosynthesis, or it's minerals that are mobilized from those tissues to help support another tissue grow. Typically, what we think about is a source being a leaf, and the developing flowers, pods, and seeds then become the sink. So the source to sink is really important in soybean. The amount, we talk about source and sink strength is really critical. We need to have a good sink strength there. We need to have enough of a vessel for us to put all the energy into at the very end in order to maximize our yields. And this is something I've been going around and around with some of my colleagues about, is this question about seed number versus seed size in soybean. What's more important? These things get back to source strength, sink strength. They also get back to effects of stress on these various things at various times. This isn't the end all of this. I'm just going to show you this one data slide from a paper recently published. I think this is relevant for us. It basically captures what I'm guessing is kind of the summary on all this. This is one particular study that looked at seed number versus seed yield. And you can see as we increase seed numbers on an area basis, we increase yields. How important is seed size? Well, it's important, but it's not that important, okay? So we had a quick discussion last night about yield evaluations and these crop tours and counting pods for soybeans. And I think everybody knows that soybean yield estimations are difficult, but the Pro Farmer or USDA, everybody else is able to somehow come up with numbers that end up fitting pretty well with our yields in the end. We can argue how well they do, but they do, these pod counts do something. The reason they work is by this. The problem is there is some air in this, and the air around this increased seed number versus yield is because of this. Sometimes we get bigger seeds than others. This is data from 2023. This is, as I mentioned earlier, I do a lot of work on soybean composition. This is just one of the things we measure is seed size. We had areas in central Illinois that had very large seeds. So these are areas that the crop ended up yielding better than anybody expected. If they would have done a pod count in this area, they would have underestimated yields. If you would have gone out in southwest Minnesota, or southwest Iowa, sorry, and done pod counts in August, you would have vastly overestimated yields in that area because they had quite small seed in this area. Why do we have large and small seeds? It's just the way I talk to lay audiences like buyers and things of soybean that are interpreting these yield contests or yield evaluations, is that these relative differences in seed size are just based on the relative conditions of the crop. This doesn't mean we had high yields here and high yields here. It just means we ended up with better conditions at the end of the year than the plant thought it had at the beginning of the year. It's relative conditions of the crop. So we could have put out, this could be, it wasn't this year, but low or small seed size can come from perfect conditions very early, then tough conditions later on. It's just the difference in conditions in between the middle of the year and the end of the year. So this brings us to this question about the critical period in soybean and how soybean and whether soybean is sensitive to stress and when it's the most sensitive. I mentioned earlier that tasseling period is really important for corn, and again, this is something that we all talk about as farmers and agronomists and extension folks, is monitoring the conditions of the environment and management of that corn crop during tasseling. So this is effects of stress on corn. This is relative yield potentials here. We have the biggest effect, downward effect on yields when we stress corn right at tasseling. Winter cereals, it ends up happening a little bit earlier. But the question is, where does soybean lie within this? And I think the conventional wisdom is just like we all talk about, August makes beans, or late August, early September in my mind. I think most of us kind of repeat these adages a lot. And I think that's pretty well characterized by some early research. This is Dennis Egley at Kentucky, R1 to R5. But that's all the way beginning of July, all the way out through the middle of August. So that's a long period of time. This is an Argentine group more recently. Actually, the slide that I showed earlier is from them. They think this R3 to R6 period is more important, and I think that matches more with conventional wisdom, with what we see in the fields here. That same group, those guys based it on this data, which I think is not very conclusive, but they basically did a meta-analysis of all kinds of studies that looked at stress on soybeans from various times. So here we have VE in the crop, R1, so again, beginning flowering, R3 is beginning pod, R5 is beginning seed, full seed, and then R7 is mature, beginning maturity. What they found is about R5.5 is where we had the largest risk of yield loss in soybean. But the part that I argue with this data in is they had studies that showed you could stress the crop at any period of time and not see anything. They only drew some kind of lines around this by hand and said, you know, this is the extent of the data, so this must be the most important time. This is the average of the data here. It kind of takes a dip, but it's certainly not very conclusive in my mind. So we wanted to look more deeply into this. And the folks in Argentina were really only looking at seed number as well. And I'm a believer that seed size is important for yield. And so we wanted to look at both yield, grain number, and seed size. So of course, a farmer's only really interested in the yield side. But from an academic point, we want to know what happens with seed numbers and seed size. So we did trials in 2022 and 2023. I'm just going to show you the 22 data. The 23 data is exactly like it. We just haven't completed all the steps of the analysis yet, so this is complete, so I'm just going to show you the 22 data. But you can be assured that everything was the same in 23. We did, I mentioned earlier, crop physiologists love shade cloth, and that's what we did. We put out shade cloths on soybeans from R1 all the way to the end. We move these shades about every 8 to 10 days, but we move them at exactly 150 megajoules of energy removed from light energy at the top of the canopy. This way we have we can actually model this now. So we know how much energy we removed from that system for each of these growth stages, so we know exactly how much effect they would have had. Not only is it the identical amount, but we know exactly how much it removed from each of those treatments. So this is what happens for grain numbers. So let me walk you through this really quickly. Again, each of these treatments represents a shading event for about an 8 to 10 day period during these periods. So we either shaded the crop very early at V3, at V6, R1, R2, R3, 4, 5, 5.5, 6, or 7. Okay. This is what we did to grain number, so seed number. This is really wild. Never expected it, but we actually saw an increased seed number when we shaded these things very, very, very early. So I mean, before R1, we shaded these things and we saw increased seed numbers. We saw increased branching in these crops, and I'm still arguing with the Naeve that I work with about what that really means. I don't think we saw more branching in the earlies, but we saw more pods on low branches with early shading. For some reason, this early shading actually promoted that soybean to put on more pods low in the canopy, and so there was more opportunity for yield to be made when we shaded that. So there's something about this early phase of stress that actually pushed that soybean to put on low pods. And we don't know what this means. We have to track this down. We shaded at R1, no effect. R2, maybe a little bit. But then once we started shading these at full pod, or beginning pod, and beginning seed. So beginning pod is really at a time when I don't consider really into reproduction yet. I think of the plant more on a mechanistic level, that R5 is really when we start setting seed in the plant. That's when I think of the soybean plant is going into reproduction. R1, 2, 3, 4, we're making a few pods, but the plant has not really invested much in the machinery for reproduction, and it still puts on more leaves. We're still putting on leaves until all the way out to this R5.5 period. So you can see we reduced grain number when we stressed crop at the very beginning. It makes some sense. This is when the plants are putting on little pods. The reality is what we're probably doing is we're aborting individual flowers. Soybean, once it makes a pod that's a 1/4 inch long or so, it's going to see that thing to the end unless it gets really nailed by stress. Soybean is going to abort all of its flowers if it's stressed, but it's going to retain any little pods because it's already started to invest in that. And so that, again, there's some evolutionary mechanism here where once that investment's made, it's going to maintain those little pods. So stress early on reduces our seed number. By the time we got out to R5, 6, 7, that shade didn't end up affecting seed number at all. How about seed size? Well, you can already see that we got something quite a bit different. When we stress these early on, you get a reduction in seed size. Okay, so I mentioned source strength, sink strength early. Maybe this will come around in your mind to think about why this might happen. Why did we have a reduction of seed weight when we stress these very early on? I haven't given you many opportunities to chime in. Why did we reduce seed numbers or seed weight when we stressed the crop, when we had this very early stress? Does it make any sense? Seed number went down even though we shaded these things at V6, V3, V6. Meaghan, do you know? We saw reduced seed size. We saw reduced seed size because we had made more seed. We put on more seed, and the plant didn't have the capacity to fill those additional seed. This crop was source limited. Okay? The crop was not seed number limited. The crop was source limited. If we put on an extra pod, it just meant that all the rest of the seed are going to have to be a little bit smaller. Okay? We saw increases in seed weight when we went out to R3 and then back down to reduction. So the real question that we have is really what does this impact, what's the impact on yield? So this is what happens. If we make more pods early on, we don't have the capacity to fill them. We basically have flat yields. We start to reduce grain number, and once that grain number gets low enough, then we actually can increase the seed size proportionally. So we have no effect on yield all the way through R3. We can push seed numbers in a big way, and the seed size tends to react to it, but the yield effect is flat. So the soybean's able to compensate. So again, this idea that soybean is pretty resilient crop, I think, is maintained with this idea. and the crop just deals with it. But what it tells me is that we didn't have any extra capacity to put on extra yield, even when we had extra seeds. But that's not the real part of the story. The real question of the story is, when was the big yield effect? And this is what we were after. It's right here. We had the greatest yield effect at R5 to maybe close to R5.5, because at this point we had both a reduction in seed number and seed size. So one of the other kind of odd things about this, though, is looking at green stems. Does any folks in this area have any problem harvesting green stems in the fall? Common complaint? Is it field-wide? Is it a few plants here and there? Is it only where you put fungicide on? Depends on the season? Well, I think so this is a paper we just wrote. It hasn't actually been released yet, but the Science for Success team is going to have this out. It's just a 2-page, very high-level discussion about green stem disorder. And so that'll be available sometime in the next month or so. But what we did see was something very interesting in this particular study. We saw the greatest number of seed green stems right at R3. This is also when, well, you can see it here. This is also when our seed size was maxed out. So this plant actually had enough resources to max out the seed size, and it wasn't able to increase yields anymore because it was limited on seed numbers. So what I think is going on in this thing is we're basically, these crops are limited by seed number at some point, and this is the case where this probably happened at R3. We didn't have enough seed out there. The plant has resources to fill those seeds, and the resources end up piling up in the stem. So you've got sugars, mineral nutrients that hang out in the stem. There's just not enough place for them to go. Nobody's ever really published on this yet, but my feeling is that we've got situations where we have stress early in the season, maybe as early as R3, maybe drought conditions in Illinois, improved conditions later. The plant recovers, but it doesn't have a large enough seed set to actually really maximize yields. You end up with very large seeds, but you would have had a better yield had you had a better seed set. Now, the point's probably a little bit moot because we had stress. The crop didn't think it was going to be able to maintain all the seeds it had, so it probably aborted some early flowers. We didn't get the seed numbers that it could have supported, knowing what kind of nice conditions we had later because of rainfall. So I think we might be able to use green stem as an indication of when stresses came and when they recovered. But this is really pretty early into this. But this is, it basically supports some of the arguments that I've had physiologically about what might be behind green stem. So I'm going with it because I like it. But we'll see where it goes. So anyway, the most critical stage here is really this R5 stage. I thank you. I'm sorry I kind of put you to sleep with my physiological presentation late in the day. We probably should have scheduled me first thing in the morning. But if there are questions, I'd be happy to talk about those. We can address any of those as we go here. Before lunch, I'm sorry.
Can I ask
of course.
You said early on that you didn't see a benefit from seed treatment, and that was from data from 10 years ago, correct? Do you see different now with the earlier planting? It seems like the seed treatment maybe had more of an effect.
The question about seed treatment and whether we're getting whether we should expect a better response from seed treatments now because of early planting. I've done a gajillion studies on seed treatments. The long story is when we first started doing seed treatment work, the companies came back to us and said, you're not getting good responses because you're not planting early enough. So then we planted really early. And I'm from Minnesota, so we plant, and when we plant early, it takes at least 3 weeks for the soybeans to emerge. So we've put them under significant stress for a long period of time. And then we don't get a response either. It looks like there is a sweet spot for seed treatments. And I don't think I don't think this is very helpful to you, I'm sorry, but I'll give you the academic view. I think when we plant very early into cold soils, our soybeans take too long to emerge to have really useful, or able to take advantage of the actives in those. We've lost a lot of the active ingredients over that period of time. Now, you've got much warmer soils, even though you're planting maybe in April, even than we have planting in late April in Minnesota. So maybe you're not in that situation. But too early, I think we outlive the seed treatment. When we plant into warm, good soil conditions, we have too good of conditions and the plants just pop out and they didn't need the seed treatment. I think there's a sweet spot where we take 10 days to 2 weeks to come out, where seed treatments might work for us. The other place the seed treatments work is when we plant and then we get an inch of rain after. The reason is that we move that product down through the soil profile. It helps protect the root. And we physically move the product off of that seed down into the rhizosphere around where that root's going to grow. When we have perfect conditions, what happens? The bean pops out, brings the seed coat with it. We have the soil's covered with nice pink and purple and blue seed coats everywhere. It's not doing us any good on the soil surface. I think there's a positional problem with seed treatments, and there's some systemics, and the insecticides are actually pretty good, and actually the fungicides are pretty decent too. If you can get some systemic activity, that will help, but there is a big positional problem with them. And that's actually my biggest problem with the biologicals, is I don't think they're where we need them to go. So I haven't seen any results that say that we've improved the response to seed treatments. I think there's a belief that there is, but I haven't seen it. I'm not going to say there isn't, but I just haven't seen the results.
So if the critical period of soybeans is around R5, and going back to the beginning of your presentation about the yield enhancers and how you find limited results there, I don't know very many people are putting those yield enhancers on at like that critical period versus on corn. Well, everybody's spraying at BTR1, right? So has there been testing at that kind of later period for soybeans on those?
I like that question. That's really a good question. And no, I think a lot of, there's a couple things going on. One is some of these things like we need good penetration of the canopy for a lot of these products, like the fungicides, to work. We need to get them on early so that they're there when we have problems. So we're putting these things on before. So an R3 application isn't too much of a stretch to think that some of these things we need an R3 application to help us at R5. The cynical view, and you've heard a lot of cynicism from me already, I'm sorry, but the cynical view also is that nobody really wants to be out in soybean canopies at R5 driving around. And so we know we know what the yield loss is from driving down a canopy at R5, and so we have to have something that benefits us enough to be able to counteract that effect. And so that's the other side of it. So there's not a lot of push for products to go on that late. And again, I think the more important point is that we need to be ahead of that stress period with anything that we would put on. So I didn't fully answer that, but did I answer it enough? Do you think I've got more?
I'd just like to see some later testing.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that's good. I think you're right. Yes.
I may not remember the data well, so share what you know, but the state specialist in Wisconsin is a big proponent, soybean specialist, of inoculants.
Oh, yeah.
I'm also a big proponent of at least a fungicide and insecticide. And they shared data that talks about like a 1.8 bushel response against untreated soybeans with F&I. And then the inoculant, something that was above a bushel. Now,
yeah,
maybe statistical relevance is not there. But.
So Dr. Connolly, through this biological trial that we're all part of, has changed his tune a little bit on inoculants based on last year's data. So if you really, really listen carefully, yes, he's promoting use of inoculants, but he said, we got this benefit because it was a dry year last year, and he thinks that's the response. And I've looked at the data, and it's really one site. Sean uses some very liberal statistics with things, and he's a good proponent of some of these things. I can't disagree with him on inoculants, because I for one would say inoculants is one of the, for taking the Hippocratic oath here, do no harm. Inoculants aren't going to kill you. It's only a couple bucks. And there's nothing in there that's going to have any downside biological consequences for us for the future. So I am not against inoculants. I'm just kind of surprised that he's already been so positive on them, because he and I wrote a really thorough paper that said they didn't do anything for us, and now he's got a really nice positive response. So it's pretty typical. And I don't know, he is a little bit more positive on the foliar fungicide than I am. They've just seen a little bit more response on the Wisconsin side than we have in Minnesota on it. We don't have that much different environments, but I think he's just picked up a little bit more. But again, what we're talking about is he's talking about 1 bushel increases, and I'm really thinking that we need to see a couple bushels in order to know that something really works. I want assurance that it's going to work for you, and I know farmers hear a bushel and they say 12, 14 bucks. That's good. I see 1 bushel and say, nobody really knows where a bushel is. Nobody can measure a bushel. A bushel is kind of a phantom out there that we're chasing. And so I know it fulfills this idea that I'm an old cynical curmudgeon about things and I need to have 95% confidence interval on these things. But I think in order to ensure farmers that things are going to work well, I want them to be pretty satisfactorily tested. That was a pretty harsh tone for Sean. We need to send him a copy of this. Oh, it's probably all over Twitter already. He doesn't have time to watch me, but he can see the last 5 minutes of this. Okay, you guys need lunch. Is there one last quick question? Yes, sir.
So obviously I'm an agronomist for a local retailer, and so we go back to the beginning of your talk, and you talked about the 6 things that we need to be looking at. So if I feel that on my growers' fields, the high management grower that I believe is looking at these things through a fine-tooth comb, what camp do we need to be looking at if this guy wants to take yields to the next level? I mean, where do you believe that we need to be? I mean, I know you're researching some of this stuff, but
I thank you for boiling it down. I mean, I rambled for an hour, and I think this gentleman has perfectly encapsulated the question. What can farmers do to increase yields? If you're already doing everything right, why can't you go from whatever 70 to 80? Is that what we're talking about? Or
I'm shooting for 100 bushel of beans. That's what my growers are asking for. And I'm to the point now where I don't. There's things I'm trying, but just like in your researches, you see it work one year and it's not the other, and inoculants.
So the question is absolutely right on target. We're all frustrated with this crop because it won't behave the way we want it to. We can throw money at it and it doesn't respond to that, and we're frustrated by it. And I think that's just part of the deal in this crop, is that we really have to have things all come together right. There's a lot of unknowns. That's why we're studying a lot of these narrow things like this critical period. We're looking at maturity groups, trying to identify how to move varieties and planting dates to avoid some stresses so that we can fit in the right spot. There is not one thing that a farmer, I don't think that a farmer that does everything else right that I talked about, the basics. If you do everything right, you just have to have good weather and things have to go right for you at the end of the year. But I do, I'm open to fungicide applications. I'm open to, putting insecticides out there. I think those things work. I just don't think this idea that just because you have good yields already and you want higher yields, it doesn't give you, it doesn't open the opportunity to buy yourself higher yields by adding one of these other products. It doesn't come that way. Soybean, I think if you want to have the real answer on soybean, what my gut feeling on soybean is managing. If we could identify what the perfect canopy structure was with soybean for a particular environment, we want to have X, tons of biomass, or a soybean that's, up to your armpits, or whatever the measure is, relative to the yield potential. I think that's the next opportunity for us as breeders and physiologists to understand what the perfect growth habit for soybean is for a particular location. Because what dings us on yield is we either get too big and too leggy, they make too much biomass, and then we don't have any yield, or we're not big enough, the soybeans just stall out, and we don't have enough nodes, we don't have enough pods on there to fill out. It's back to this sink source question, but that's really a messy thing, and it's because the crop doesn't respond exactly like we had expected to, and we never know what kind of year we're going to have in the end. I'm sorry I didn't answer your question at all.
I mean, we're potentially finding some kind of a cap here to an extent, without knowing environmental conditions, what we're going to have, correct?
We're capped, and we're capped by the breeders because soybean is a tough crop to breed. It has a really genetic heritage. We're basically have 17 lines we brought from China. That everything is based on those, and I think five of those original accessions make up like 85% of the germplasm. So we just keep crossing the same stuff. We don't have this hybrid capacity to bring in new genes and make crosses like we do with corn. We're just recycling. The breeders are basically recycling all these same crosses, and they're hoping they come across something that does something a little bit better. But we're really limited by the genetics of the soybean crop. And so the big things are really going to come someday when we have real genomic enhancements to soybeans. But we're really a long ways from that, because all the stuff that's going to work for us is really complicated. And so far the breeders have only been able to put one gene in at a time. So I'm going to hang out for a few minutes. I got to get back to O'Hare, but I'll be around for a few minutes on the beginning of lunch, so please stop up and chat with me, but I'll turn it back to Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Naeve. So this concludes our presentations. I'd like to thank again all the presenters that came, and obviously they traveled quite a ways, and I mean, who wants to go to O'Hare? And so if you see them, thank them. Thank you so much for traveling here to Northern Illinois. One last time, Soybean Summit, February 1st. Don't freak out. We have met full capacity of the event. We're expecting that not everybody shows up. We are accepting walk-ins still for that event, but we are starting to get a lot of questions about that. Don't worry if you can't register online, but it is closed at this time. So again, Soybean Summit, February 1st at the iHotel in Champaign. It also will be broadcasted on YouTube, so I'm getting that question as well. It will be live on YouTube, thanks to Kelsey Litchfield. If you want to look at the full agenda for the Soybean Summit, go to lsoyadvisor.com. Next, we want to make sure that you are going to get an evaluation for today in your inbox. We want to make sure that you do fill out that evaluation. We want you to also know that we really do value your feedback. We do look at that. And based on what you put on there, we will enhance our events for the coming year, not just in the winter, but also for the summer. Lastly, again, everything that we do, our home is lsoyvisor.com for the latest agronomic advice and programming in all forms. And it's designed to enhance not only your sustainability, but also, most importantly, profitability. All this valuable content is accessible for free online 24/7. And we also have Soy Advisor on Twitter and Facebook, so don't forget to get those updates. As we conclude for lunch, Connie wanted to make sure, again, if you need to stop back at the table, we have a lot of giveaways. At one point, we ran out of corn and soybean field guides. She has replenished those. So if you need one of those field guides, you lost it in your truck, go pick another one up. Again, take the opportunity to network, have conversations, and also don't forget to connect with our ISA agronomy team. Before you depart, don't forget, like me, to fill out that CCA form. With that, Steven says we're ready for lunch. I'll go. Thank you.